Expected, but really kind of nice. I'm going to read what I have to say, because it's kind of new, but it's part of my work on thinking about black aesthetics and shame specifically. So I hope you like it. I hope you find things in there that are interesting. I hope you ask me questions so that I can, think some more about this very important topic. All right, so here goes. This is the introduction, and I'm going to get as far as I can get, then I'm going to stop. So somebody tell me, when I'm like 2 seconds from the end or something. All right. Post-race differential aesthetic inclusion means that Lupita Nyongo, Alec Weck, Michelle Obama, and Nayakim Gatwech can be named the most beautiful women of the year, become the global faces of beauty products that sell transracially, and be feted as supermodels. This differential aesthetic inclusion might lead us to think that aesthetics is post-racial, where post means that we're past race and its aesthetic hierarchies. It can also lead us to believe that black is beautiful as a site of aesthetic political activism and debate, as well as its accompanying beauty politics is no longer necessary. Indeed, we could be led to believe that politics is defunct because of some black women's inclusion in the realm of beauty, a beauty with a politics of commercial skin values which still maintains colonial aesthetic hierarchies, irrespective of the differential inclusion of women with darker skin. From a black decolonial feminist lens, the analysis uses skin stories from Michelle Obama, Lupita Nyongo, and Nayakim Gatwech to outline the emergence of other skin values beyond the politics of the market dictated by colonial aesthetics. I look at how it is that in the 21st century, a black woman's melanin maintains its hypervisibility by first thinking through darker skin politics in the African diaspora. As hypervisible signifier of black African descent racial difference, skin is still the bedrock of a misogynoir which has embedded within it affective, aesthetic, and political economies which continue to circulate as discourses of ugliness, both physical and moral. These discourses keep black beauty shame in circulation. It is these discourses of dark skin as ugly, laid over the surface of the body as a second skin, which conditions the politics of hypervisibility within which these women are surrounded as darker-skinned African descent women. Living their skin lives through resistance to discourses of negation denies this ugliness, even whilst this second skin extends across interpersonal, political, social, and cultural relationalities. Thus, their very refusal to problematize their dark skin, whilst it still overwhelmingly continues to be problematized societally as ugly, is enabled by what Césaire calls a disalienation from these discourses. Disalienation is looked at as encompassing many different forms, but is essentially a turning away from negative discourses of dark skin, which seek to interpolate them as other, towards different modes of being and becoming, which do not start from whiteness or shadism. The next bit is skin and its discontents, from colonial discourses on black women's difference to shadism. We can start from a very specific proposition. That is that black women's bodies are always already marked as pathological within the global north and global southwest. An example of how early this began can be seen in the Middle Ages, 1119 to 1142, when religious scholar Peter Abelard wrote to Eloise about the Song of Songs. He said about the Queen of Sheba being sexually intimate with King Solomon, these are his words, "Besides, it so happens that the skin of black women, less agreeable to the gaze, is softer to touch, and the pleasures one derives from their love are more delicious and delightful." Black women's skin, although softer, was already marked as ugly in the Middle Ages, whilst they were seen as offering intense sexual pleasure. Skin and hypersexuality already marked Sheba as black other. Marking the gendered and raced boundaries of European national identities and white supremacy continued with early European travel writers who represented African women as monstrous bodies. Their bodies were desirable and repulsive, available and untouchable, productive and reproductive, beautiful and black, centuries before the UK's colonies in North America and the Caribbean were established, according to Morgan and Gilman. Skin shades have had resonance within the Black Atlantic world for centuries. For example, in the Archive of the Indies in Seville, it is possible to see requests for licenses to travel to Latin America from Spanish families, which list household members, both free and enslaved, in terms of the constructed caste shade categories generated from blood quantum. Some of these license requests to travel are with mulatto, Zambo, and Morisco household members and are dated as early as the 1500s. According to Hilary Beckles, the noted Caribbean historian, during slavery in the Caribbean context, the black woman was ideologically constructed as essentially non-feminine, insofar as primacy was placed upon her alleged muscular capabilities, physical strength, aggressive carriage, and sturdiness. Pro-slavery writers presented her as devoid of the feminine tenderness and graciousness in which the white woman was tightly wrapped. The history of the black woman's body in the European, North and South American imagination is imbricated within the racialization of colonialism and enslavement, which still remains active today, both in metropoles and former or present colonies. Indeed, for Hortense Spillers, the black woman's body has provided and continues to provide an essential other for the construction of white US American and also European women's bodies. The darker-skinned black woman continues to be a marginalized corporeality in white US, UK/European, Latin American, Caribbean cultural consciousness and representation. We can say that there's a repetition of images of dark skin as ugly in the UK, US, Latin America and the Caribbean, deriving from shared North and South Atlantic universals of what dark skin on women's bodies constituted. For example, such skin constituted ugliness, backwardness, Africanness, masculinization, poverty. These are some of the things that spring to mind. The gaze from white and lighter iconic skins continues to reproduce dark skin as multiply displaced and undesirable, though paradoxically a source of endless fascination, as we can see from Yancy's work. Drawing on the earlier work of Charles Parrish, Jeffrey Ann Wilder's research in the United States indicates that there has been no change in colorist ideology among African Americans. The attitudes and names associated with light skin tones tended to be negative, while those related to dark skin tones were derogatory, but medium skin tones were viewed most positively. For Wilder, colorism in the USA seemed to not be operating in the traditional binary logic of racialized skin politics, but was within a three-tier system with brown at the top of the hierarchy. This preference for brown and orientation away from dark skin also maps onto Jamaica's browning, Brazil's mulatto, and Cuba's mulatto as well, and the Dominican Republic's denial of African descent alongside embrace of indigeneity and Spanish descent brownness, for example. In the global North and global Southwest, dark skin color continues to speak racialized otherness and ugliness in post-settler colonial, post-plantation, and post-colonial majority black metropolitan societies. Indeed, it is through skin shade that we still intuit who can be human, even in those post-colonial societies which appear to be racially homogeneous. Thus, skin is not just organic, but is highly politicized as hyper-visible signifier of racial difference, as Kobena Mercer reminded us. Further, our racialized and gendered identifications emerge in the flow between skin shades as meaning-filled and effective body surfacings. Beyond the interpersonal, skin shade has been and continues to be the building block of nations, affective economies, aesthetic hierarchies, transracial intimacies, transracial dislocations, and structural inequality within the USA, Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the African continent. It is from within this historical and contemporary aesthetic matrix that we see discourses of dark skin on women's bodies as ugly, backward, masculine, desirable, repulsive, and disparaged, spreading out as a second skin to impact black women through misogynoir. I'm going to move to that now and look at Michelle Obama, Lupita Nyongo, and Nayakim Gatwich. Moya Bailey coined the term misogynoir in 2010 to describe black African descent women's specific experiences of the intersections of sexism and racism. This is experienced as absence within presence, hypervisibility plagued by invisibility, as well as hatred but inclusion with provisos. We could claim that misogynoir is even more marked when dark skin covers a black woman's body, both as organic matter and as discursive second skin, which is embedded with the texture of shadism and centuries of its construction as signifier of racial otherness, inferiority, atavism, and primitivism. We can see this discursive second skin in Michelle Obama's right to bear arms, with which her first term as First Lady of the United States, FLOTUS, began. The media storm over her so-called rippling biceps illustrated that in the USA, the respectable femininity of the FLOTUS is still judged from the gaze of dissection emanating from whiteness. It was unnecessary to say, "Ooh, look at that, FLOTUS is black and dark-skinned." This is because her masculinization, through drawing attention to her arms, was also compounded by her darker skin. Such masculinization as part of the discursive second skin extended from the plantations to impact Michelle Obama in the 21st century. Thus, she was constructed as a body out of the FLOTUS White House space because of the skin she inhabited, through the regurgitation of discourses of dark-skinned women as masculinized, which existed in colonialism and enslavement. The media storm occurred because Michelle Obama's arrival as the first African-American FLOTUS into the White House disturbed the status quo because she was not what Puar calls a somatic norm. As a dark-skinned black woman, she coexisted uneasily with the white somatic norm, as we can see in the aping heels comment when she was compared unfavorably with Melania Trump and its aftermath in 2016. Through this comparison between Obama and Trump, we see the same naked racism as the attention to her arms, because she is known only through a second skin, which places her as an unknowable threat to the white body politic, socially, politically, culturally, aesthetically, and psychically, but also a knowable threat as well. This second skin is always known within the North, South Atlantic, and Caribbean universal racial epidermal schema, in which black bodies are, to quote Fanon, sprawled out, distorted, recolored, animalistic, bad, mean, ugly, cannibalistic, lascivious, but most importantly, feared. Overdetermined by this second skin, Michelle Obama had to performatively enact a known bodily hexis as FLOTUS, which, as in times of empire, can be simply put as civility. This civility was measured through how our body spoke, looked, behaved, and was adorned. Michelle O had to use glamour and professionalism so as to undermine the threat posed by her dark skin to the body politic imagined as white and male. We can see this in the focus on our arms, where there's dark skin, where we can perceive fear, revulsion, and white ontological insecurity, even as the force of the racist episteme is imprinted on the body, to quote Puar. As Charles Mills says, the white body continues to be the somatic norm, even if it is no longer judicially or constitutionally supported, because the racial contract demarcates space, reserving space for its white first-class citizens. Michelle Obama caused severe disorientation as a member of the USA's racialized internal colony, who was inside the First Lady's space. She was inside the First Lady's space as a negation of the norm. So to read a little bit from a newspaper clipping, a magazine clipping, on Nayakim Gatwech, I'm quoting it now. It was from Teen Vogue. South Sudanese model Nayakim Gatwech, called Queen of the Dark, has taken the world by storm simply because she celebrates and loves her darker skin. Nayakim went viral after posting a story of her interaction with an Uber driver on Instagram. When the Uber driver asked if she would bleach her skin for $10,000, Nayakim laughed it off. "I would never do that. I consider my skin to be a blessing," she told him. To take the world by storm simply because you celebrate and love the dark skin which you live in means that dark skin continues to be seen as problematic by the world. Dark skin is something that still attracts negative affect, such that the article makes us assume that she should hate rather than love her skin, as well as not celebrate it. Of course, we have to wonder which world is represented here, and state that it is a world dominated by white supremacy and shadism, which together produce the iconic norms of whiteness and lightness as skin ideals. In contradistinction to this world, she sees her skin as a blessing and would not bleach it even if offered a considerable sum of money. Again, she counters the ruling episteme and a global beauty industry in which whiteness, lightness is prized and brownness is desired. She has caused a storm because she transgresses a racial aesthetic contract in the global north and global southwest, which has been for centuries in the making and which is so pervasive that it has almost managed to disappear into thin air because its negativity is a taken for granted aspect of social life. It is something that we're all inculcated to expect within a global north and global southwest libidinal economy, to use Frank Wilderson's term. Well, his work, in which dark skin on a woman's body as a second skin places her at the bottom of the aesthetic hierarchy because of the limited value attached to that skin tone. It is worth repeating here that this second skin is produced in political and social conditions, not of its inhabitants' choosing. Therefore, the libidinal economy of dark skin is important to think through because of how tenaciously fixated we all are on such skin, and the fact that skin can be the basis of affiliation or aversion. As well as being the scene of philia or phobia, dark skin can also structure emotional, affective, and psychic life, as well as political economy and societal structuration. Dark skin libidinal's economy operates in tandem with the political economy of whiteness and shadism. Here, dark skin is reproduced continuously as negative and is subject to aggression, phobia, as well as violent consumption. However, such an economy can also be positive in terms of attraction, alliance, and affection, as we see with Gatwech's comments. Dark skin's libidinal economy can also be the source of exceptional inclusion into an industry which prizes and fixates on unusual skins, as we've also seen with Alec Weck and Grace Jones before her. The psychic life of dark skin phobia means that Gatwech should see her skin as a burden, not as a blessing, something to be vilified, not prized, something to be erased from representation, not reproduced by her or others in Instagram and YouTube posts. This psychic life is also reproduced through black communal and individual shadism, as we see in the example of Gilberto Arenas' comments about Lupita Nyongo. And this I got from a magazine, The Griot. And the heading was, Gilberto Arenas says, Lupita Nyongo ain't cute, in tirade about dark-skinned women. And this was this year, April 14th. Arenas has found himself under fire for his comments about dark-skinned women on Instagram, in which he claimed that very few dark-skinned women are beautiful. The athlete even slammed actress Lupita Nyongo as not cute. In response to an Instagram post from Pro Black, I think, that read, Dear black girl, you don't have to be mixed to be beautiful, Arenas went on a rant. How black are we talking? Not to be funny, can you name a beautiful black woman on the outside, not brown skin, like Tyrese Black? When you say African features black, then you have hashtag one Lupita Nyongo, and she's cute when the lights are off. So the black beautiful woman you try to boost up is, that's a direct quote, technically light-skinned or brown-skinned. After intense backlash, Arenas still refused to apologize for his comment on Nyongo. Arenas separates black from brown skin when he talks about beauty, because for him, what he calls African blackness, such as Nyongo's, is not cute. In fact, he sees her as only cute when the lights are off. Although later apologized to black women, the tone of his apology is deeply offensive and misogynist, and I won't repeat it here. This brutal assault on dark-skinned women brings to mind the words of the Middle Ages religious scholar Peter Abelard, with which we began to historicize the connections between dark skin on a woman's body, ugliness, and pathology as constructed in the European imagination. Shadism and white supremacy are then different sides of the same coin within the libidinal economy of black women's dark skin. Such a political positioning should be a point of concern, if not outright anxiety, for those members of the black community in the diaspora and on the continent who think and act in these shadist terms. We're left with a question at this point. That is, what can be done in such an African-phobic world in which misogynoir dictates that black women with darker skin continue to be othered? What Gatwech and Obama have shown above is resistance to second skin, which takes the form of a turning away from it as a determinant of who they can be and become. They absolutely reject its boundaries and limits. I want to continue to look next. Have I got time? Shall I just keep going? Okay. I want to continue to look next at the turning away from the libidinal economy of dark skin as negative, which Gatwich and Obama have modeled above, and will do again next, in common with Nyongo. In this reorientation, to take from Sara Ahmed, this turning away from dark skin phobia, we see the resistance of disalienation, which is essential to reproducing a dark skin other than it once was perceived to be, through second skin discourses and imaginings. That is, disalienation is focused on constructing black women away from their inscription by Abelard in the Middle Ages and from Beckel's historical account of black enslaved women and the gender politics which surrounded them in Caribbean and other plantations. Resistance through disalienation then begins the work of decolonizing dark skin, which is necessary to do if we are to continue to assert its aesthetic value away from the commercial market in skins, and or even through those markets themselves when stripped of their tendency towards what Wilderson calls violent consumption. Thus, decolonizing dark skin by resistance through disalienation incites the creation of a new libidinal economy of dark skin based on philic attachments. And that's the next bit that I'm going to go to now, resisting darker skin othering through disalienation and creating a new libidinal economy of dark skin. For Aimé Césaire, the being and becoming of the colonized is circumscribed by white supremacy, such that the colonized cannot fully occupy the category human. In order to become human and leave behind a colonized thing, the colonized woman has to disalienate from the scene of her racist subjugation, from the white supremacist constructed impossibility of her being and becoming human. This is at root the work of disalienation. It is about resistance to the second skin constructed during a long history of European construction of black women as other, which had its zenith in settler colonialism and enslavement. Such resistance severs links to racial and gendered subjugation by reconstructing self and society based on the gaze of black decolonial feminist critique. So what could be the outlines of such a critique? In an interview with Oprah Winfrey, as she was about to stop being FLOTUS, Michelle Obama spoke at length about how to deal with negativity. She said that she has a defense mechanism whereby she does not hold on to the bad stuff, including being called an angry black woman. I thought at the time that this occurred, when she was called an angry black woman, she said she thought, dang, you don't even know me, where did that come from? Then you sort of think this isn't about me, but about the person or people who write it. Obama's claim that this is not about me, but about the people who write it, think it, and speak it, already orients us to a new position on the angry black woman comment. That is, it is not of her. That anger is being ascribed to her because of the second skin which threatens to encase her. From this second skin, she can only be known as white-generated stereotype, rather than herself as an individual me. She goes on to say in that interview that color and wealth are not things that define us as people, but rather it is how we live our lives that matter. She says, so I thought, okay, I will just live my life out loud and let people judge for themselves. Living one's life out loud is already a position which turns her away from stereotypes on the dark-skinned black woman. She lived her life as FLOTUS, as Michelle Obama, the first African-American First Lady, in a way that she chose, not as dictated by the media. In doing that, she also allowed the American people to judge the quality of their FLOTUS for themselves, rather than being media dupes. Through her own act of freedom, she also freed the American people to interrogate the racist stereotype of black women so deeply held that it continues to inflect dark-skinned women's lives, even hers. At base, she engaged in a reconstruction of what black women can be and become outside of the confines of the stereotype, reconstructing the human as raced, gendered, abled, sexualized, and classed becomings, which can be imagined otherwise and performatively enacted and brought into being, is the work of disalienation. In this disalienation from the stereotype of the angry black woman, she engages in what Judith Butler calls a livable life, free from the grief caused by shame-inducing anti-black woman racism. In other words, she recreates the libidinal economy of dark skin through resisting racist phobia and violent cannibalization of her body parts and psyche in the media. That is, if we see cannibalism as domination, fear, absorption, revulsion, and dehumanization. In her resistance to this domination based on negative racialized affect, Obama refuses to be the sum of her body parts, so that the media could not project onto her their own taboos or pathological psyche, on pathological psyche and aberrant flesh. Supermodel Naya Kim Gatwich challenges beauty standards on Instagram. She says, "I love who I am. I love my skin tone." And to quote again from Teen Vogue this time, "When model Naya Kim Gatwich was in middle school, she cried herself to sleep thinking she wasn't beautiful enough. Now the 24-year-old Sudanese model has become an icon of beauty and an inspiration to young women everywhere. Her secret? Self-love. She says, "It takes time to love who you are. Be confident in whatever the situation is. If you love yourself, other people will see. It will shine through, and then they have the choice to accept you or walk away. When I put a picture up, I'm telling people that no matter what you say, I love who I am. I love my skin tone. I'm telling people that I'm beautiful even though I look different from the majority of the people in the world I live in." Gatwich's resistance through disalienation occurs through self-cannibalization, which challenges racist perceptions of low self-esteem and ugliness attached to women with dark skin. Tell me when he arrives, I'll just keep going. Is he here yet? Okay. See? I had to check because I just keep going, right? She does not wait to come into being through the other of the West, which would be a position of self-negation. Her pictures are a demonstration of self-love, resistance in the face of the violent consumption of shadist and white supremacist hate. Through love of self, she remakes the world in which she lives, which removes her resistance from being charged with narcissism or vanity to anti-racist image-making beginning from the self as political actor. If we notice her words above, she begins also from a position in which she locates the source for her action through the use of complaint. I'm telling people that no matter what you say, I love who I am. The who is as important as the self-love here, as they humanize her through her own gaze in the face of the dehumanization meted out to black women with darker skin. I'll stop.
Yanis, just to let you know, if in 30 minutes' time when George speaks, we could have a lapel mic down here, that would be perfect. And also, could you mute the screen when you can do that now, in fact. Thanks. I'd like to introduce Richard Seymour, the second speaker on this third panel. Providing I can find the right page. Here we go. Richard Seymour is an author, broadcaster, and a founding editor of Salvage, a quarterly publication of revolutionary arts and letters. Seymour received his PhD in sociology at London School of Economics and is the author of 5 books: The Meaning of David Cameron, Against Austerity, How We Can Fix the Crisis They Made, The Liberal Defence of Murder, and Unhitched, The Trial of Christopher Hitchens, and recently, I believe, published in a second edition, is that the right phrase? The book Corbyn, The Strange Rebirth of Radical Politics, published this year in expanded form by Verso, I think. Thank you very much, Richard Seymour.
Bear with me while I just get my script ready. Okay, before I get into this, everybody can hear me okay? There's no problem there? Yes. All right, great. Okay, where's my thing? As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. I'll say that again. As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. Doesn't make any sense. Let me try another elaboration. I'm quoting James Baldwin. He said, insofar as you think you're white, you're irrelevant. We can no longer afford that particular romance. There's still something quite odd here, because it seems an odd way to put it, at least in terms of our common sense discourse, because we're supposed to think of whiteness as something special that's given to us, like a privilege, or something that we're born with as a privilege, something that those interpolated as white are getting something out of. At its best, in a sort of Du Boisian kind of analysis, we tend to talk about privilege as a set of material effects, relative advantages, which have the effect of consolidating the loyalty of of poor whites, white workers, and so on, to a system that ultimately exploits and disadvantages and harms them. Acknowledging the inadequacy of privilege as a concept for explaining that, we can consider it, in Derridian terms, sous-rature, under erasure, still legible as long as we haven't got an alternative. But I think we should not move too quickly to sense-making. As we'll see, it isn't always our ally. I want to take you back to a moment last year. There was a man named Thomas Mayer who engaged in an extraordinary act of violence. He hunted Joe Cox, who was a pro-migrant centre-left member of Parliament. He stabbed her in the chest with a dagger. He shot her twice in the head and once in the chest with a sawn-off shotgun. And then he stabbed her again repeatedly. The eroticism of Mayer's overkill, the physical proximity he chose as he set out seemingly to physically annihilate his victim, is difficult to miss. It suggests a passionate identification with what he was trying to destroy, or in Fanonian terms, a counterattack upon desire. In court, he gave his name as Death to Traitors. Now, we can pretend we know what's going on here. There is a politics. Mayer was obsessed with apartheid South Africa. He was obsessed with southern United States segregation. He was besieged by a persecution fantasy wherein white leftists and liberals were betraying the white race, had in fact already betrayed it in the case of apartheid and Jim Crow, and he was a believer in separation. In a way, he gave force of arms to David Starkey's expressed concern a few years ago, if you remember, during the England riots in 2011, that the whites have become black. Well, what kind of answer is that? It's a story, it's a narrative, but it doesn't make any sense. Murdering an MP, much less ferociously slaughtering one, won't bring back apartheid, clearly. And besides, what did he think was being lost if whiteness was being lost? What did he mean by whiteness, and what do we mean by it? I want to take you to another act of violence from March this year. This time an attacker named Khalid Masood, a Muslim convert born Adrian Ajao, slammed a fast-moving car into a group of people, crashed the vehicle, clambered out, dashed toward the Houses of Parliament with two huge knives, stabbed a police officer before being quite predictably and efficiently shot to death. He never stood a chance of getting close to Parliament, where presumably he must have imagined he might confront the centre of an oppressive power. He killed 4 people, he injured dozens, for what? To what end? We'll never know what name he might have given in court, because unlike Mayer, he was killed. Maybe, like Richard Reed, another convert, he would have declared, "I'm an enemy of your country and I don't care." Same day as that killing took place, the US Air Force bombed a school near Raqqa, killing 30 people. Trump approved it, but it was in fact deployed in line with existing bureaucratic imperatives and strategies within a certain jurisprudence, along certain chains of command. And the ideology of war and terrorism would have us believe, well, this makes sense. It illustrates how the violence of imperialist states is constrained within reason, justice, and humanity, because they do things according to law, chain of command, and so on, while that of opponents is always nefarious, groundless, unchastened by human decency. And if you don't believe that, you can always take the consolation prize, which is the belief that there is some proportionate realpolitik material gain to be had from all this carnage. And to be sure, someone is getting something out of it somewhere, but it still doesn't add up. There is always a point in the life of white supremacy and imperialism where the sense-making apparatuses break down. And there is no mystery about the fact that US bombing raids, drone attacks, invasions, assassinations, and so on always exceed any plausible strategic purpose. The occupation of Iraq was conducted as though, rather like Khalid Masood's massacre, it was designed to thwart all strategic purposes. The destruction of the Iraqi state, the defiling of Iraqi cities, the training and operation of death squads. Afghanistan, still rolling on, a war which saw even higher rates of aerial bombardments than in Iraq, with a statelet rump of warlords, patriarchs, and religious fundamentalists mobilized in a war against other warlords, patriarchs, and religious fundamentalists. And now we're at war with something called the Islamic State, a brutally and garishly auto-orientalizing, religious fundamentalist, and you might say almost fascistic type of organization, a direct product of the war in Iraq, and a beneficiary of the degeneration of the Libyan and Syrian uprisings against autocracy, one whose ostentatious brutality is somehow as fascinating for our newspapers as satanic cults and Hitler worship is to bored American Midwestern teenagers. And predictably, the ground war has been won more or less at the moment, only for us to discover, with yet another vehicular attack, this time in New York City, and more afoot, that the ground war was only ever a phase in a mutating battle that we insist on seeing through to the darkest end. Inquiry that we, by all means. There's something desperately frightening and volatile and supererogatory about all of these situations. Yes, there are strategic imperatives involved. Yes, there are perceived interests on all sides. Yes, there is a concrete politics. Yes, the world is never completely lucid. Yet the consistency with which we drive towards more chaos and more bloodshed and keep foolishly making sense of it is exactly what led Freud to postulate the existence of a death drive. The psychoanalyst Octave Mononi, who was still in an early phase of his ongoing attempt to decolonize his profession, beginning with himself, when he wrote this, said, "The ghost of the former colonial subject haunts, without their being aware of it, relations among whites who have never left Europe." Fanon, with his emphasis on colonial projection and the socio-diagnostics of what he characterized as a neurotic colonial situation, wouldn't have been surprised by this, nor should we, since it is a well-known fact. We live in the UK, and the dread of migrants in British politics, upon which the success of the Leave campaign absolutely depended, is strongest in those areas where migrants are fewest or non-existent. It is indicative of an unprocessed colonial desire in circulation, a desire for a plenitude of being assured by the fantasized omnipotence of global white supremacy, the British Empire, a desire turned inward and toward a defensive white nationalism. But I wonder if we can still really talk about, as Fanon did, of a neurotic situation. There are suggestive analyses along these lines. J.M. Coetzee's Freudian take on the apartheid mind, which was basically based on the writings of Geoffrey Cronje, characterized it as having an obsessional neurotic structure in its attempt to ward off death by waging a war on shit. Its belief that the similarity of conditions among poor blacks and whites would lead to the whites becoming black, and the structuring principle of race disintegrating into an indistinct pulpy mass. This has eerie resonances with the story of Thomas Mehr, whose ritualized defenses against shit, I don't know if you read much about him, but it included the careful, pristine, and well-ordered hoarding of toilet paper. But I don't know if that's generally valid anymore. In our updating of Fanon's work, systematically deploying the Lacanian psychoanalytic categories that Fanon himself occasionally alluded to, Kalpana Seshadri Crooks argues that what we call whiteness is rooted in unconscious signifiers. What does that mean? Well, you will have noticed how invisible whiteness sometimes seems to be. Barbara Fields, who's an American historian, points out that we only tend to see race when a non-white subject is involved. That's why there are scholars and black scholars, women and black women. Outside of racial crises, when the defenders of whiteness emerge to aggressively conserve and restore supremacy, whiteness is somehow both determining and not there, a present absent cause, the race of no race, unmarked. To be white is somehow to be both centrally involved in the production of race, yet also at some day-to-day level convinced that one's whiteness has no bearing on one's interests or actions. It's analogous to the way in which we only notice nationalism when it's oppositional. Another way to put this is to say that the signifier of whiteness, and whiteness is a signifier before it's anything else, is unconscious. It is part of a combinatory of signifiers, starting with the black-white binary and unfolding into potentially endless permutations, the n+1 of race. Seshadri Crooks writes that to be raced is to be subject to the signifier of whiteness. And what exactly is that signifier doing? Well, to grasp this, we have to understand how Lacan sees human experience as being roughly divided into three kinds of register, three different levels, if you like: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary dimension is quite familiar, actually. It's just the order of, it's images. It's, you first experience it as an infant, catching your reflection in the mirror and being told by your mother, that's you, that is. And you look back and you confirm, and she gives you a glance, and then you know. And that dimension comes to include all the identifications that you form, the way in which you internalize the descriptions that other people make of you, and they become part of you. Starting with your parents, you form an imaginary ego. But then we start to learn something else. We start to learn language and culture, and we're given prohibitions and law, and that's the symbolic order. We internalize these prohibitions and we start to repress because we learn there are aspects of our psychic life that we have no business having, that are, strictly speaking, prohibited. The domain of language is the domain of signifiers, and Lacan argues that the image that you might have of yourself has to be held in place and given its distinctive social and cultural and psychic meaning by the signifiers attached to it. So seeing an image of so-called white skin would be meaningless. There would have to be a signifier of whiteness attached to it, giving you a comprehension and memory of yourself as a white subject. Then third, there's the real, the irreducible kernel of human experience that eludes both image and symbol. It can include elements of sensuous experience, drives, and so on. That is the element, you might say, of madness in us all. What Michael Eigen calls the psychotic core, the part of us that has no accountability to reason or logic. The real is manifested mainly in its effects, in the way that it distorts the surface of reasoning and imaginary identifications. Maybe at night you have obscure fears. Maybe if you see a spider in the bathroom, you jump 2 feet. Maybe if your partner smiles at someone else, you experience an unaccountable and totally irrational fear of abandonment. Maybe you find yourself doing self-destructive things over and over again, which you don't understand. This is just the quiddity of human experience, the warp and wend of life. Run it through the filter of race, of course, and something else happens. Maybe if Europeans once dreamed of black people they had never met, one wonders about whom they dream now. Maybe in place of a fear of spiders, you get a fear of Muslims. Maybe when we talk about terrorism, one of the things we're talking about is white terror. What does the signifier of whiteness offer in this context? D.H. Lawrence wrote in a mad and frankly, in some respects, very seductive essay, Reflections on the Death of Porcupine, of the great chain of being. He suggested that life is more vivid in the dandelion than in the green fern. Dandelion is a nonpareil. Foolish, foolish, foolish to compare it to anything else. He said, life is more vivid in a wren than in an alligator, more vivid in a cat than in an ostrich. I don't know why he made these comparisons. And he went on to say, more vivid in me than in the Mexican who drives a wagon for me. He went on, we are speaking in terms of existence, that is, in terms of species, race, or type. What's whiteness doing in there? It's being introduced, you might think, to bring the ecstatic encounter with nature under some sort of control, because whiteness promises an impossible fullness, an unreal, an unrealizable plenitude of being. That's what Seshadri Crooks means when she calls whiteness a phallic signifier. It is the signifier that can say it all. The idea that you can have access to some maximum of enjoyment and being in the community of whiteness. Now, there's something quite uncanny and frightening about the idea of absolute being, absolute enjoyment, limitless enjoyment, and so on. It's a bit like this. If you have everything, you can want for nothing. That means there's nothing left to desire, and that means that life actually becomes quite horrendous. Not only that, but insofar as limit is law in an anthropological sense, to be without limit is to be free to do anything. That's completely impossible as a basis for community. As a basis for community, you need certain prohibitions, like the prohibition on cannibalism. Not coincidentally raised here, the prohibition on incest. Well, lack has to be restored somewhere if you're going to have a fantasy of whiteness, and it is, of course, restored in the signifier of blackness. And from within this binary, rooted in the unconscious, secretes racial fantasies, fantasies of lawless omnipotence, frontier fantasies, empire fantasies, slaveholder fantasies. The fantasy that you can do anything you like to a certain type of person. Sheldon George, in his psychoanalytic study of trauma and race, points out that the consequences of this for African Americans subject to these signifiers even today. You see, whites in the slave South, of course, were hardly ever denied any right over slaves because the normal operations of limit didn't apply. And insofar as slaves were permitted any fantasy of being whatsoever, and fantasies of being are absolutely inescapably part of our existence, we all need them, it had to come from the church, it had to come from religion. And perhaps the only thing that wasn't really permitted to white men at this time was homosexual desire for black men. Vince Woodard wrote in The Delectable Negro of how unconscious desire for black male flesh, the repressed homoeroticism of white men, was canalized in relations of paternal violence, savage lashing out, and even instances of cannibalism, which of course is projected onto black people. Baldwin once speculated that were it not for post-emancipation migration, the entire region of the South would have become an absolutely homosexual community based on white male desire for black men. And this must be one of the things that is meant by colonial desire, and one of the things that has taken place when white people dream of black people whom they have never met, both a projection and a desire, or, to put it another way, both a desire and a counterattack upon desire. But this is still speaking within the domain of a so-called neurotic structure based on repression and father figures and paternal sovereigns. Now, those traditional stern father figures are somewhat in decline, and that's a very good thing. What I want to ask then is what happens if these relations begin to dissolve in a way that preempts and deflects the emergence of a productive alternative to paternal law? Because we're talking about capitalism here. Well, I think the answer to that is to look at the MRA community and their worship of the primordial father Trump. You might know that in Freud's myth of the primordial father, the idea was that there was an ancient male who had limitless access to all the women. And then all the sons had to gang up on him and murder him in order that they could impose some sort of distributive justice. You know, this is yours, that's mine. Obviously, this chiefly pertained to possession of women because it was about patriarchy. It was about father saying to son, no, that's my woman, go and get your own. Well, the decline of traditional fathers and the heteronormative sexual relations that they prop up is creating all sorts of chaos in the kingdom of Oedipus. The idea that boys are destined to be men and girls are destined for men is disappearing. It's no longer really clear who is supposed to be fucking whom. The panic among some that it is generating is leading to a revival of the primordial father myth, which assumes the form of a bastardized Darwinism and a vulgarized evolutionary psychology. If you listen to MRIs, you often hear a lot about the female hindbrain for some reason. Well, in a way, this is a situation that would tend to select for what Lacan called a psychotic structure based on not repression, but on the foreclosure of law and limits. And without the paternal law to anchor experience, to give it a coherence and continuity, psychotic experience can be one of being bombarded, blasted, assailed by bits of reality, objects, voices, numbers, incandescent alphabets, as Annie Rogers put it. The spontaneous self-cure for this is to create a delusion that somehow pulls all these bits of reality together. But a delusional structure remains stuck in what Lacan would have called the imaginary order, the order of identifications, of rivalry, of aggression and aggressivity. And it involves, rather than repression of whatever is unbearable, its projection, its externalization, so that it is experienced as attacking one from the outside, threatening one with annihilation. In that sense, Fanon's work stressing the projection and the moral splitting that was already involved in colonial ideology and practice already alludes to a psychotic kernel. And perhaps in a way what's happening is that the psychotic kernel in all of us is in some ways, in some parts of, among some people, being slowly liberated, which, if true, would raise the stakes of social conflict considerably by weakening the mediating structures of the symbolic order and leaving us with a whiteness that is primarily an aggressive response to its own projections, its own dread of and fascination with annihilation, its own desperate search for a delusion to hold things together, or a master with a delusion to give it some sense of making sense. Now, I'm not saying that we're already there. I should clarify, by the way, in case anyone thinks I'm trying to stigmatize psychosis, I'm not. I think, as I say, that psychosis is part of a universal part of human experience, but it also shouldn't be romanticized. But this is a matter of tendencies, potentials, and directions. Going back to colonial hauntings, there's a short story by Ellis Sharp called Dead Iraqis from 1991, in which the charred bodies of former colonial subjects don't so much haunt as hang about, causing a nuisance to morally apathetic, dissociating English people. And by the way, that moral apathy and dissociation is what we call stoicism, the stiff upper lip, and the spirit of the Blitz. This is a classic example of what surrealists call dépaysement, wherein something takes a detour, appearing outside of its usual context, giving us a different understanding of it. What would happen if those dead Iraqis began to explode? In other words, what would happen if someone in the UK, racially oppressed, abused, lacking an alternative political vehicle and identification, were to identify with a dead body? What if, in an era in which Islam is in some ways the new black, racially persecuted, surveyed, punished, demonized, they were searching for their own delusion and found it in the idea of martyrdom? In this volatile situation, it need only be a handful, many of them converts, or at least with a decidedly ambiguous relationship to traditional Islam. If certain forms of whiteness thrive on the prospect of annihilation, so clearly do certain forms of what we could call counter-whiteness. And they are mutually, though certainly not equivalently, co-constituting. And in a nuclear world where this principle is structuring, annihilation is a very real prospect. This is a spiral that we're locked into, but it's one of many death spirals, if truth be told. And it's a cliche and it's a piety that we always have to try and crowbar, acknowledgement of something like climate change into this. I did want to mention it because I don't think it's separate from what we're talking about. Except that, of course, we're already too late. Every sign tells us the change is already irreversible. The signs of biomass depletion, carbon concentration, ocean acidification. We're talking about driving ourselves toward a planet in which the food chain collapses and the oxygen supply depletes. The Paris Accords are approved overwhelmingly by US fossil fuels industries precisely because they won't prevent this. For reasons unknown to us, scientists have determined, paleontologists, that the planet undergoes a mass extinction event roughly every 26 million years. They don't know why. It's linked to carbonization of the atmosphere and abrupt changes to living systems. Beyond that, we're not sure. Humans only exist because by some freak chance, one of our ancestor species got through an era in which the planet was very low on oxygen and was nocturnal enough not to be eaten by dinosaurs. There's no reason we have to be here. We don't have an inherent right to be here. We seem determined to hasten the next extinction event and not to survive at this time. And I don't think you can talk about the political dynamics locking us into species death unless we talk about, of course, capitalism, but also race and fantasies of omnipotence and of absolute mastery over everything which we call nature, which, of course, in white supremacy includes all non-white humans. If we rush to make sense of these things, we are unconsciously relying on the signifiers of race to make sense of it for us. We're making things appear to make a spurious sense, covering over the disconnects and nonsense of this terrifying, chaotic global system with the unwitting aid of whiteness. And that's reconciling us in a way to a status quo that should horrify us. Whiteness is not a privilege but a plague, even those who obtain a relative advantage from it. And the relative advantages, of course, grow as you ascend the class terrain and shrink as you descend. They're still kidding themselves. You listen to them talk about climate change, the white middle-class American right, and increasingly you hear the subtext become text. We, rich white people, can survive this. It can even be good for us because it'll be bad for poor people, black people, it'll be bad for the Chinese, the Indians, the competitors. And if it freezes over Europe, well, they've had a good run. This is lunacy. Climate systems don't work that way. They don't respect the boundaries of racial metaphysics or national boundaries. Human beings do. We're the only ones who do that, and that's why we're propelling ourselves to ultimate destruction. Now, I'll just finish on this. In warning against or warning about a raising of the stakes of social conflict, I want to clarify something. I'm not here to argue against social conflict or militancy. We need militants in this situation. We need people who are prepared to contend. We need converts, and I don't mind using, even if parodically, the language of religion, because I want to know not how to get someone to be more polite about their unconscious racism, how to manage it better, how to reflect on it in order to become more civil. There are, of course, many worse things than bourgeois civility. There's Trump, for example. But I fear that ultimately it fosters idolatrous attachments. Identity in the modern sense is necrological. It is an obituary notice that overwrites us in lapidary fashion with the deposit of history, race, class, sex, nation, a list of attributes. It is somehow both about singularity and belonging, who we uniquely are and who we are like because of our ancestry. We feel the urge to belong, and one of the worst punishments is banishment from a community, beginning perhaps with the childhood experience of being made to stand in the corner facing the wall. Yet the claims of group experience can also be oppressive. They demand too much of us. Conformity is mocked, but so is pretension. Our mother tongues attract and repel us. We are ambivalent about our identities, and they are ambivalent about us. They chew us up, but they also spit us out. And idolatry, the worship of a particular identification, is a way of suppressing that ambivalence. We need to explode the contradictions, to prize open the claims of race, the work that it makes us do on its behalf. We need to free ourselves of the signifier of whiteness, and we should be recruiting people, converting people to radical transformation, and I have no apologies to make. I call this socialism. Conversion is a good place to start, because it is talking to someone on the level of their desire to change both themselves and the world. Someone radicalizes for the first time, they're already changing every bit of them from head to toe in ways they don't even know yet. And that's when you can say to them, as James Baldwin did, you can have your good conscience, you can have your anti-racist piety, you can have your radicalism, you can have everything as politically correct as you like, but let me tell you, friend, as long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. You're a lost soul. Your whiteness is not your ally, not your privilege, not your enabler, but a plague. And as long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you. But in the book of Samuel, it says, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, you'll know the move is on. Get ready. You're about to fight the Philistine army. Thank you very much.
Yanis, how do I turn this on? Sorry to make you come down. Thanks. Thanks very much, Richard. That was really interesting. I'll now introduce George Yancy, who will deliver the keynote lecture for this evening. That will be followed by a panel discussion and plenty of opportunity for questions. George Yancy is Professor of Philosophy at Emory University. He received his PhD with distinction in philosophy from Duquesne University, where he was the first Moccanielti Fellow. He He received his first MA in philosophy from Yale University and his second MA in Africana Studies from NYU, where he received the prestigious McCracken Fellowship. He received his BA in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh. His work focuses primarily in the areas of critical philosophy of race, critical whiteness studies, and philosophy of the black experience. He has authored, edited, or co-edited over 18 books, which include, and I won't list all of them, or I'd like to, Exploring Race in Predominantly White Classrooms, Scholars of Colour Reflect, Pursuing Trayvon Martin, Historical Contexts and Contemporary Manifestations of Racial Dynamics, Look, a White, Philosophical Essays on Whiteness, and Critical Perspectives on Bell Hooks. The first edition of his book, Black Bodies, White Gazes, received an honourable mention from the Gustavus Myers Centre for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights, and 3 of his edited books have received Choice Outstanding Academic Book Awards. Yancy's work has been cited nationally and internationally in places like Turkey, South Africa, Sweden, and Australia. He is editor of the Philosophy of Race book series at Lexington Books and is known for his influential interviews and controversial articles on the subject of race at The Stone, New York Times. He has twice won the American Philosophical Association Committee on Public Philosophy's op-ed contest. His most recent books are the second edition of Black Bodies, White Gazes and a co-edited book entitled Our Black Sons Matter. His book on race, 34 Conversations in a Time of Crisis, is published by Oxford University Press this month, I believe. Yeah. And Backlash, What Happens When We Honestly Talk About Racism in America, will be published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2018. One last thing, because I have to read this. Noam Chomsky says of Yancy's book, Backlash, quote, George Yancy's courageous appeal to white America to confront the problem of whiteness, to cultivate a critical awareness of the spectre of whiteness and white privilege that each one of you inherits, elicited a remarkable range of responses, some hideous beyond words, some welcoming, and what he rightly called a gift. This eloquent meditation on the events and their meaning calls on us, with piercing honesty, to think hard and work hard to excise the malignancy of white supremacy from our culture and our lives. It's my great pleasure to introduce George Yancy.
Okay, can you all hear me? I'm good? Okay, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I didn't want to stand because I like to walk. I can't stand still that long, so just move around a little bit. So thanks to Daniel and for Isabel, right? For inviting me, and also for my son. Of course, he's not here. He's back at the hotel. Because when I got the invitation, I said, I am not flying because I don't like to fly. And he said, Dad, we're going to London. So I don't know where he is, but he's somewhere shopping or whatever he's doing. But anyway, so I'm honored to participate in what seems to me to be, from what I've heard, an inaugural event, a very powerful inaugural event. Fair enough. And what I've learned, and I'm just going to put this out there, I think that white people here have a hell of a lot of work to do. I think we can say this conference has been quite incredible to this point, yes, which is a little hand clap for that in terms of the work that you've done. Thank you. So I cut this back significantly, but I'll just start reading. So if we are to discuss, and the title, of course, is Black Bodies, White Gazes, the Breakdown of Whiteness. If we are to discuss critically and effectively the issue of whiteness, I argue that parrhesia, now what is parrhesia? It's P-A-R-R-H-E-S-I-A. Parrhesia is fearless speech, or to say it all. So I argue that fearless speech, or fearless or courageous speech, is so important. But along with fearless speech, we need fearless or courageous listening, which I see as an openness to have one's white assumptions shattered, one's white self fissured, to have one's sense of white ethical certainty called into question, to have one's white self touched to the point of vertigo and perhaps even crisis. And I'm using that in a very specific way. Part of courageous speech in philosophy is to be a troublemaker, a contemporary gadfly. Being a troublemaker involves risk. As for academics, by troublemaker, I don't mean being clever or showing us how good you are in refuting the arguments of your colleagues. More is at stake. Cultural theorist Bell Hooks says that she came to theory because she was hurting, because she was in pain. And how many of us here in this room, at this conference, are here because we are hurting, or because we're in pain, or because we suffer? Frantz Fanon, author of Black Skin, White Mask, says, quote, I want my voice to be harsh. I don't want it to be beautiful. I don't want it to be pure, end quote. I fear that what I will have to say here, or that I will leave white people here with very little hope. So I'm not here to give you hope. I realize that there are many of you who will say, but Yancy, UK whiteness is different from North American whiteness. Fine, I haven't lived here. But I see whiteness as a global phenomenon. So I'll wait to hear from those black bodies and bodies of color here in the audience who will speak the truth. Because for me, when discussing whiteness, whether here or in the US, I can't completely believe what white people tell me about whiteness. And that comes from my notion of what I call opacity and whiteness as an embedded phenomenon. We can talk about that perhaps during the Q&A. So when I'm talking about whiteness, or when we are talking about whiteness, we need something far more dangerous, something far more disconcerting, unarming, alarming, traumatic. It seems to me that what I'm suggesting here is compatible with parrhesia. When it comes to discussing issues regarding whiteness, within contexts like this one, we mustn't be like Odysseus, who dared to be adventurous and yet remain safe. We must allow the sirens to sing to us without the safety of a mask, without plugging up our ears with wax. When it comes to intimate and courageous discussions regarding race, how it is lived and how it is experienced and how it is avoided, we ought to allow for the strength of the aleatoric, the unpredictable spaces of openness to fracture calcified norms and unproductive sedimented practices. We must be daring. We must be vulnerable, which means that we must be open to be wounded. We must be open to rethink how we are always already touching. We must be daring, must be vulnerable again. Which means that we must be open to be wounded. And again, indeed, we must be open to die. There's a necessary kind of death. A death to your white stubbornness, a death to your white denials, a death to your white innocence, a death to your white epistemological ignorance, a death to your white arrogance, a death to your white narcissism, a death to your white goodness, a death to your white fears, a death to your white color evasion, a death to your white denials, a death to your white self-righteousness, a death to your philosophical purity, a death to your illusions of safety, a death to all of those tricks that you play to convince yourselves or me that you are fine, that you are one of the good ones, the sophisticated ones. But what if white people, no matter what your good intentions are, continue to be the problem? In fact, let me just ask the question. What if to be white is to be racist? Now, my answer to that question in North America is a definitive yes. So I'll just ask this question, just ask it and put it out there. If to be white in London, what if it's true to be white in London or in the UK means to be that you are in fact racist? What does that mean? But if to be white, and which means to be racist in America, then what does this mean for me as embodied as black? Within a North American context, what if at the end of the day, after all of the work that I do, my life, my black body, continues to function as a site of nullification? What if as black I am already just waiting for the next act of white racist microaggression, insult, humiliation, violence? In fact, what if I'm just waiting to be killed under the logics of white supremacy, white privilege, white power? What if at this moment, for me, right now, is just a temporary reprieve from death, from the inevitable hand of white supremacy? My point here is that whiteness is parasitic upon my blackness. Whiteness is the knot of my blackness. If this is true, does this not mean that whiteness is empty, that it's false, that it's consumptive, and that it needs me in order to stay alive? Whiteness on this score is a site of body snatching or body consumption. What this means paradoxically, among other things, is that my death, let's call it black death, sustains your life, let's call it white life. The knot of whiteness looks something like this. Ruth Frankenberg writes, quote, "As I and other white colleagues have argued elsewhere, there are times when whiteness seems to mean only a defiant shout of, 'I am not that other,' end quote. On this score, as white, the I, in its social ontological constitution, is fundamentally marked through negation. The white I, then, is constituted within a space of relationality alterity. At the heart of whiteness, though, is a profound disavowal. I am not that. As Steve Martineau succinctly writes, quote, white identity loses its freedom through its identity dependency on the other. But this dependence is then disguised by means of a standard inversion. The ethics of whiteness and white supremacy determines that it is the other, a black person, for instance, who is perceived as the source of one's unfreedom, or one's felt unfreedom, end quote. Theorizing the dialectics of white racialization, John Warren writes, quote, whiteness does not persist in a vacuum, but in relation to non-whiteness. By uncovering the ways white persons either identify or disavow others, one works to uncover some of the mundane ways white people produce race, end quote. Or, as my colleague Barbara Applebaum writes, quote, a white subject's intelligibility is dependent on ontologically abject non-white others who preserve the boundaries that protect one's ability to be perceived as intelligible. Regulatory norms operate through the subject who repeats and perpetuates the norms that sustain the subject's intelligibility, end quote. And as James Baldwin puts it, and puts this very powerfully, which was taken earlier from me, but of course I'm taking it from Baldwin, that's fine, quote, but if I am not the nigger, and if it's true that your invention reveals you, then who is the nigger, end quote. Baldwin goes on to say, I give you your problem back. You're the nigger, baby, it isn't me. As long as whites are themselves, or see themselves as normative, or even are cited, I'm arguing, as normative, and I am the nigger qua, or I am the different qua nigger, discourse about my personhood will function as a cover, a mere farce, an empty gesture. Baldwin's point forces us to ask, will the real nigger please stand up? And if one stands, then how does one sustain the weight of that truth? How does one tarry with that truth? The truth that to be white is to be the nigger and is to be the problem. I know close and upfront about the dangers of whiteness, to live itself as a lie, and how its structure is a negation of my blackness, of me. For an example, some of you might know that I wrote in 2015 a very controversial letter called Dear White America, which will be now Backlash, the book, which generated over 2,000 comments at the Stone, the New York Times. For that letter, I received tons of hate mail, really vitriolic white supremacist responses, in my university inbox, voicemail, even snail mail, in fact, even postcards. In some cases, white people would actually write letters, take them to the post office, put a stamp on the envelope, just to call me a nigger in writing. And as some of you might also know, police presence was necessary during my presentations, such as this one. There's no police present here. And also the FBI got involved. White supremacist and alt-white websites discussed the letter, and I was invited to appear on Fox News and other social media outlets, all of which I decided to decline. Here are a few of those responses that I received from white writers. And I want to share what white culture sounds like to me, what white culture feels like to me. You should know that my Dear White America letter was intended as a letter of love to white people. In fact, I called it a gift to white people. So here's a little warning in terms of the blatantness of the language. Voice message. Dear nigger professor, you are a fucking racist. You are a piece of shit destroying the youth of this country. You are neither African nor American. You are a pure 100% nigger. You would never marry outside your nigger race. That's a fact. You're a fucking smug nigger. You are uneducated with education. You are a fucking animal, just like all black people in the United States of America, including that nigger Kenyan that was born in fucking Kenya that has usurped the White House. Yes, it is called the White House for a reason, because white people made this country great, you fucking nigger. That is white culture. Hey, Georgie boy, quote, hey, Georgie boy, you're the fucking racist asshole. You wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for affirmative action. Somebody needs to put a boot up your ass and knock your fucking head off your shoulders. You stupid fucking goddamn racist son of a bitch. You fucking race-baiting son of a bitches. Man, you're just asking to get your fucking asses kicked. You need your fucking asses kicked. You stupid motherfucker. Quit fucking race-baiting asshole. End quote. That is white culture. Inbox message. Quote, Professor Yancy, all your studies have forced me to examine my self-image and my white racist mind. You clearly state that no matter what I think, I am a racist. Okay, cool. Thank you for clearing that up for me. Now I am forced to say, because you tell me I can say nothing else, fuck you nigger. As always, the white guy. End quote. That's white culture. White supremacist websites. Quote, cunts like this aren't philosophers. They just hate white people. Simple. He should fuck off to Africa if he doesn't like living in a white country. End quote. That is white culture. Quote, this ugly fucking nigger, and it's here when I go, ugly? Like, I mean, are you serious? But there it is, and a little humor, right, in the midst of tragedy. Quote, this ugly fucking nigger is just asking for access to more white females. In short, I wrote Dear White America to get more white females. And I didn't put this one in, but it's in the book. One white guy said that Dr. Yancy wrote Dear White America so that white women will be willing to suck his dick. And that's a direct quote. In a sane world, this ugly nigger would be just beheaded ISIS style. Make America great again. End quote. That's white culture. Quote, you should go fuck yourself, okay? Just go fuck yourself. You're a racist fucking prick here. You're exactly the problem. So why don't you and Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackoffson all get together and circle jerk and shoot your fucking nut on each other's faces, or rather on each other's racist faces. You got the NAACP, you've got the Black Congressional Caucus, you've got BET Television, you've got every fucking thing. I don't owe you a motherfucking thing, asshole. You're the fucking racist, you dick. End quote. That is white culture. Quote, this nigger needs to have a meat hook, lovingly. Well, you know, time to use your own imagination. End quote. That is white culture. Quote, you can dress a nigger up in a suit and tie, and they're just still niggers. End quote. That is white culture. Quote, this ignorant monkey has no audience but other ignorant monkeys. End quote. That is white culture. Quote, Yancy, flights leave for Africa every day. Take one and then take a brother with you. We can all admit bringing you here to this country was a mistake. So let us get rid of you and correct the mistake. You are not happy. We are not happy with your behavior. So do it. End quote. That is white culture. Quote, there are two ways you can return to Africa. On a passenger ship or in a coffin freighter. Choose quickly. End quote. That is white culture. Some of you might also know that I wrote an article called, and also in the New York Times, called I'm a Dangerous Professor, 2016. That article was in response to the fact that my name recently appeared on what is called the Professor Watch List, which is a new conservative website created by a conservative youth group known as Turning Point USA. The job of this website is to monitor professors who teach so-called leftist propaganda. I've never taught leftist propaganda. I don't call myself a leftist. From my knowledge, I'm the only Emory professor who was listed. In my article, I argue that the watch list is indicative of the madness of George Orwell's 1984. While I received hundreds of positive responses from people from all around the world who thought that I was courageous, doesn't matter, for writing the article, there was one message that I received from a white male who apparently discovered Dear White America for the very first time. He wrote, quote, I read your rant regarding white people, and I'm proud to inform you that I will never feel any guilt or shame for being white or who I am. Fuck you, you race-baiting piece of shit. You're just another nigger with a chip on his shoulder that's looking for excuses to justify his anger. And guess what, asshole? Nobody white gives a fuck what you think. My only regret is that I didn't hear your bullshit in person, so that I could call you a fucking nigger to your face, you worthless bitch, and then kick your black ass until you are half dead. Fuck off, boy. End quote. That is white culture. One thing that became clear to me in ways that were upfront and close and systemic is that we do not live in a post-racial America. Any such claim is a blatant lie. And after so much unmitigated white hatred, I had not anticipated how what was said to me would make me feel. I had not anticipated how the onslaught of vile and racist discourse would leave a wound, how it might traumatize. My physiology registered the moods, or the wounds, mood swings, irritability, trepidation, disgust, anger, nausea. On one white supremacist or alt-right, that's interesting slip, web page, the one writer wrote the following: nigger, 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 nigger. That was the response. And it went down his page just like that. I returned to Baldwin. Quote, I give you your problem back. You're the nigger baby. It isn't me. White students. My white students are always reminding me that they are not racists. We've made progress, they say. We're not like our parents and grandparents. We live in a post-racial America or world in which you can be whatever you want to be, if only you try hard enough. We never owned black people. We've never used the N-word. We have plenty of black friends. We love rap music. And we date blacks, Asians, Latinos, and Middle Easterners. So when it comes to race and racism, most, if not all, of my white students claim to know about the absence of their own racism. They are certain that they are not racist. They are, in short, at peace with who they are. Yet, I would argue that they are at peace precisely within the context of actually perpetuating their racism. What if, at the end of the day, I'm continuing this, they continue to be white racists despite all of their good intentions and honorable actions? To repeat, what if to be white is to be racist? In fact, if that's true, what does that say about the theme that is the glue that holds this conference together? As the so-called good whites, they believe that they are already positioned beyond the muck and mire of contemporary forms of white racism, white privilege and white power, and white complicity. Indeed, there are many of my white students who give the impression that they were born from the head of a god, like Athena from the head of Zeus, fully mature and unscathed by the reality of white racism. The challenge. I challenge the same white students to keep a journal of examples of white racism that they encountered at home, at school, or just within the context of everyday conversations. Many of them were pretty sure that their journals would be sparse, perhaps even empty. Toward the end of the semester, all of my white students were deeply shocked. In fact, by the end of the semester, they had to question their sense of certainty about the non-existence of their own racism, white racism. Some came away deeply troubled by the awareness that white racism is front and center within their families, social groups, and within their dorms. And I'm just going to share 5 of those with you. First white student, quote, the first day back from spring break, we had a new student move in. When my other floor mates came and noticed this, one ran down the hallway, possibly inebriated, screaming, there's a nigger on the floor now, guys, watch your stuff, end quote. My question is, if you're black, have you ever had this experience where people look upon you suspiciously as you're minding your own business, but look upon you as a thief, a criminal, while you're minding your own business? Sort of like this second skin that was raised earlier. Second white student, quote, one white guy told me his secret thoughts while he was boxing. He said that he always imagined his white girlfriend being banged, was the term, banged by some really big black guy, and that this makes him so pissed off that he goes all out in boxing, end quote. My question is, if you're a black male, what is it about banging a white female that puts white guys in such a state of frenzy? Dare I say it? Dare I say it? Does it have something to do with fear of the big black dick? Third white student, quote, when I was on an elevator, I realized that as a black man and a black woman walked into the elevator with me, I was clutching my bag close to my body and moved it to the other side, or the other shoulder, right? I had no reason to clutch my bag other than the fact that they were black. end quote. My question is, if you're black, have you ever had this experience where white people clutch their bags when they see you approaching? Fourth white student, quote, I went to get my nails done with one of my friends, and while we were there picking out our nail polish colors, I asked her what she thought of a dark purple. Jokingly, she said that dark of a nail polish would make my nails look like nigger nails, end quote. My question is, if there exist nigger nails, then what about nigger teeth? Or nigger breath, nigger sweat, nigger hair, nigger feet, nigger food, nigger sex, nigger moms, nigger dads, and nigger babies, nigger churches, nigger clothes, nigger love, nigger music, nigger lips, nigger talk, nigger walk, nigger jokes, no good niggers, nigger scent, nigger this, nigger that, nigger politicians, and dare I say, our former nigger president. Fifth and last student, quote, one white girl was talking about why she could not date a black guy, and she mentioned the black hands. She said, when they turn over their hand, like, that is really gross. They look like gorilla hands, end quote. My question is, why are black people still depicted as monkeys in the 21st century? Now, these things are recent, by the way. Clicking sounds. White filmmaker Amy Sands tells the story of how she and her sister would travel from Westchester County to New York City with their grandparents. She says that when they reached black neighborhoods, the windows of her grandparents' car would close and the doors would lock. Quote, until dark faces appear on the street. Then the sleek electric windows slid up and suck closed. The automatic locks click down. The dark people are sealed out and we are sealed in, end quote. This is the way I want to think about this. The clicking sounds are always already accompanied by white nervous gestures and eyes that want to look but are hesitant to do so. The clicks ensure their safety, effectively re-signifying their white bodies as in need of protection vis-a-vis the sight of danger, death, doom, and blackness. In fact, the clicks begin to return me to myself as this dangerous beast, a phantom, rendering my body the site of microtomy and volatility. The clicks attempt to seal my identity as a dark savage. The clicking sounds mark me, they inscribe me, rematerializing my presence, as it were, in ways that I know to be untrue, in ways that are not me. Unable to stop the clicking, unable to stop white women from tightening the hole of their purses as I walk by, unable to stop white women from crossing to the other side of the street as they see me walking by in their direction, unable to stop white men from looking several times over their shoulders as I walk by, minding my own business, unable to establish a form of recognition that creates a space of trust or liminality. There are times when I want to become their fantasy, to become their specter, their problem. In the case of the clicks, I want to pull open the car door and shout, surprise! You've just been carjacked by a ghost, a fantasy of your own creation. Now get the fuck out of the car. But of course, this act of agency, this act of protest, would simply reinforce my black body as the site of fear. What's my point here? My point is that the simple act of locking one's car door vis-a-vis the presence of the black body constitute and sustains the false ontology of whiteness. Let's make this more concrete. What if the clicking sounds could speak? What would they say? What would they communicate to me? Click, nigger, click, nigger, click, nigger. The clicking sounds would begin to fragment my existence, cut away at my integrity, depicting me in the form of an essence. Click thug, click criminal, click thief, click danger, click hypersexual, click predator, click violent, click wild, click primitive, click angry, click savage, click rapist, click evil, click demon. I am on the receiving side of the clicks, and yet those whites in their cars, through the sheer act of locking their car doors, perform their identities as in need of safety, in the need of protection. The clicks signify multiple layers of their identity. Click white, click, white, white. Click pure, click innocent, click good, click law-abiding, click vulnerable, click decent, click threatened, click prey, click better than, click epistemically credible, click civilized, click persons as such, click human qua human. Not only are the bodies that instantiate or initiate the clicks performing their white identities through the clicks, but the clicks themselves install white identities. They interpolate or hail white identities and solidify white identities. The clicks are not isolated, pure auditory data, but markers of social meaning, signifiers of regulated space, forms of disciplining bodies, and part of a racist and a racial web of significance that bespeaks the sedimentation of racist history and racist iteration. Du Bois argues that for those blacks who have given thought to the situation of black people in America, I'll just say in the world, they will often ask themselves, what after all am I? Through an uneventful, mundane act of white index fingers locking the car doors, click, click, the color line is drawn. After so many clicks on so many occasions, I am installed as a stranger, as it were, to myself, forcing a peculiar question. Where is my body? Where is it located? The question itself makes sense once the body is theorized not as a brute extensa, for those who've read Descartes, but a site of confluent norms, as that whose meaning is a function of a complex interpretive and hermeneutic perceptual framework. I am not a criminal. I'm not a problem waiting to attack white people. Hence, their sense of safety is a fabrication. It's a lie. They have created a false dichotomy, an outside, the blacks, as opposed to the inside, the whites. But what if that inside, that feeling of safety, that fabricated space, is a construction that is parasitic upon the false construction of the black body as dangerous? If so, then their sense of themselves as safe is purchased at the expense of the very possibility for a greater, more robust sense of human community or Mitsein. They have cut themselves off from the possibility of fellowship, of expanding their identities, of reaping the rewards of being touched by the black other, and thereby shaking the apparent boundaries of their white selves. To live a life predicated upon a lie, which I'm arguing is at the very heart of whiteness, requires more lies to cover it over. Black bodies then function to conceal the truth that so many white people lead lives that are constructed around a profound deception. Namely, white people need protecting from black people or people of color. The need for this lie bespeaks a white self on the very precipice of ontological evisceration. James Baldwin writes, quote, well, the black man, and we can say woman, has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar, and as he moves out of his place, or she moves, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundation, end quote. Yet whiteness continues to remain a kind of ordered cosmological, have a certain kind of ordered cosmological structure. Even as we challenge the white gaze, it fixes us, reinstantiating us as a fixed star. For the record, we should know that whiteness as the fixed gaze is not just Procrustean or narcissistic and ethically solipsistic, but bloodthirsty, unconscionably violent. Think of the lynched black body, that to be feared and disciplined. And think here of overkill. For an example, in 1934, in North America, 23-year-old Claude Neal was accused of killing a white woman, and we can bracket that out for a moment because it's not clear to me that any black body did anything, quite frankly, to be lynched. So he's accused of killing a white woman, and it is said that a confession was wrung out of him, meaning that it was forced, twisted, or strained out of him. Neal was first dragged from his cell. He was then castrated. His penis was stuffed into his mouth, and while it was in his mouth, he was forced to say that he liked it. Then his testicles were cut off. They took those and they stuffed those into his mouth at the same time, being forced to say, I like them. Imagine that. His sides were occasionally sliced, so someone would cut his side here and then hold on to that and pull it down while he was alive. A noose was tied around his neck. He would lose consciousness, at which point they'd unloosen it. He would gain consciousness again. They would cut off a finger, cut off a toe, etc. Eventually he was killed. Well, prior to that, hot red irons were used to burn him from top to bottom. Some reports say that he had 18 bullet holes in his head, chest, and abdomen. Pictures were sold of his mutilated body, and other body parts were kept as prized possessions. So sites of lynchings were also sites of consumption, right? In that interesting way of consumption, corporeal consumption, but also capitalist consumption. Or think here of the brutalization of 21-year-old black female Mary Turner. She's very dear to me. We don't often hear about black women and lynching. She was 18 months pregnant. She identified those white men who lynched her innocent husband. Well, they took her and they hung her up by her ankles, because he's upside down, They threw motor oil on her body, and they threw gasoline on her body, and she was set alight. At which point, a white man walks over with a big butcher's knife, cuts into her abdomen, and I'm going to say it just like this, like a fucking pig, at which point the baby falls out, according to the reports. It lets out one cry, at which point this white man walks over to this delicate black skull and crushes it beneath his boot. And then her body was filled with multiple bullet holes, multiple, hundreds. Or think about the rape of enslaved black women's bodies that were said to be always sexually available, indeed hypersexual essences, things, and thereby could not be raped. Such black bodies, or what I call the other of the second sex, were metaphorically open, always desiring to be taken. Black women's bodies might be said to be holes without bottoms, or just perhaps bottoms with holes. Black women's bodies, in short, were problem bodies. And if 1934 in America is too remote to engender a sense of the gravity of the problem of how black people are treated as ontological problems and how the operations of whiteness get performed, think of 1999 in New York City when black male Amadou Diallo, who you may have heard about, a thing like Essence, always already on the brink of violence, was shot at 41 times by white police officers as he reached for his, does anybody know? His wallet and held it in the air. So our question is, what is it about a black body that holds a wallet or cell phone that somehow phantasmatically becomes a weapon? So even as he was falling, there were bullet holes in his feet. Or think of black male Abner Louima, who was handcuffed by white police officers when one white police officer stood behind him, took a stick, and ran the stick up his rectum so far that it damaged his stomach, at which point he takes this stick, jams it into Abner Louima's mouth, and then runs around the police station saying, "This is how you break a black man in." That's a question we have to ask about whiteness. What does it mean? It's perversity. It's obsession with the phallic, right? The homophobic. Or think of Susan Smith, the white woman who in 1994 drowned her own children and blamed it on a black man. Or think of Charles Stewart, a white man who in 1989 shot his pregnant wife in the head and shot himself in the abdomen and blamed it on a black man. Point being that the white police officers believed these figures. Or think of Renisha McBride, who was killed by a white man as she sought help after she was in a car accident. Or unarmed black male Eric Gardner was killed by a white police officer after being wrestled to the ground and strangled. Or unarmed black male Walter Scott, who was killed after being shot 3 times in the back as he ran away from the police officer. Or unarmed black female Sandra Bland, who was threatened by a white police officer who said that he would light her up with his taser if she didn't get out of the car, and then only to be thrown to the ground. Or think about black male Laquan McDonald, who had a knife with a 3-inch blade and was shot at 16 times as he turned away. And if you watch the film, which is difficult to watch, his body is rocking back and forth on the ground as the bullets are entering his body. And think about 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was shot while carrying a toy gun, who was said, by the way, by the police officers to have been 21 years old. And also black male John Crawford, who was killed while carrying a BB gun in a Walmart store. I'll now turn quickly to an example that helps to engage what is necessary at the level of the quotidian, the everyday, and then gesture toward what Linda Alcoff asks, where she writes, quote, "What should white people do?" end quote. Of course, within the context of this conference, we're asking the question about white culture. So I call this the elevator effect. It's much longer. I'm just going to give you the abbreviated version. Well-dressed, I enter an elevator where a white woman waits to reach her floor. She sees my black body, though not the same one I have seen reflected back to me from the mirror on any number of occasions. Her body language signifies, "Look, the black." On this score, though short of a performative locution, her body language functions as an insult. Over and above how my body is clothed, regardless of the fact that I wear a suit and tie, she sees a criminal. Indeed, she does not really see me. Despite what I think about myself or how I am for myself, her perspective, her third-person account, seeps into my consciousness. I catch a glimpse of myself through her eyes, and just for that moment, I experience some form of double consciousness. But what I see does not shatter my identity or unglue my sense of moral decency. one might say that the white woman's consciousness of the meaning of my black body coincides with the meaning of the black body as such, and that from her perspective, there is no meaning that the black body possesses that is foreign to her. That is, a meaning that is capable of enlarging her field of consciousness or seeing. The Negro, as Fanon notes, quote, is a phobogenic object, a stimulus to anxiety, end quote. As black, I am the looked at. As white, she is the bearer of the white look. She clutches her purse, eagerly anticipating the arrival of her floor, knowing that this black predator will soon strike. As she clutches her purse, I am reminded of the sounds of whites locking their car doors as they catch a glimpse of my black body as I walk by. Click, click. She fears that a direct look might incite the anger of the black predator. She fakes a smile. By her smile, she hopes to elicit a spark of decency from me. But I don't return the smile. I fear that it might be interpreted as a gesture of sexual advance. What she sees or hears is governed by a racist epistemology of certitude that places me under erasure. Her alleged literacy regarding the semiotics of my black body is actually an instance of profound illiteracy. Her gaze upon my black body might be said to function like a camera obscura. Her gaze consists of a racist socio-epistemic aperture, as it were, through which the white light of truth casts an inverted, distorted image. It is through her gaze that I become hyper-vigilant of my own embodied spatiality. Notice that the white woman in the elevator need not speak a word to render my black body captive. She need not scream, rape. She need not call me nigger. Indeed, it is not a necessary requirement that she hates me in order for her to script my body in the way that she does. White America has seen to that, or the white world has seen to that. What then on the elevator am I to do? So we're coming to an end. Am I doing well, time-wise? What am I to do? Within this racially saturated field of visibility, as Judith Butler might say, I have somehow become this feared predator stereotype from which it appears hopeless to escape. And by the way, I'm not describing something abstract. So I've been on elevators where this has happened, right? And I know other black males who've been on elevators where this has happened. The white woman thinks that her act of seeing me is an act of knowing what I am, of knowing what I will do next. That is, hers is believed to be simply a process of unmediated, uninterpreted perception. However, her coming to see me, and the way in which whites generally come to see me and other bodies of color, is actually a historical achievement. Within this dynamic racialized space of the elevator, I've become the externalized figure, the fantasized object of the white woman's own distortion. It is this distortion that carries an existential and ontological surplus, providing her with a sense of positivity vis-a-vis my negativity. On the elevator, do I enact a disruptive counter-white racist performance? And if I did, what would that look like? I could also attempt to trigger a sense of shame. I could say something like, "Miss, I assure you that I am not interested in your trashy possessions, and I especially have no desire to humiliate you through the violence of rape, nor are my sexual desires outside of my control. Thank you very much." Then again, she could be thinking, "Nigger, just who do you think you're talking to?" Hence the uppity nigger. Then again, what if I have in fact positioned her to feel shame? What if she leaves the elevator feeling bad about what she did, feeling bad about her whiteness? But what happens when this feeling gets quickly transformed into a positive sense of self-discovery? What if she now takes that discovery to indicate a form of transcendence beyond all things racist? She now becomes the good white, no longer concerned with black pain and suffering, or my pain and suffering, but now her pain, her guilt, her need to feel good, pure, and ethical. In short, she fails to tarry with black pain and suffering. And she also fails to tarry, T-A-R-R-Y, with the complexity of her whiteness. What appeared to be a movement toward undoing whiteness is actually reinscribed as a place for precisely doing whiteness. So my question becomes here, how has whiteness in this conference reinscribed itself? What have we really accomplished? And this is just it. 2 more pages. And what if the elevator broke down for 6 hours while we're on it together? What if she got to know me differently during those 6 hours? What if her perceptual practices began to crack, though slightly? Is this not the beginning of a bridge? My sense is that we need more experiences where the spaces that we inhabit break down, like the elevator. Spaces where we get to dwell near each other, where you, as white, get to see yourself as the problem. Even those whites who take it that they're doing something very significant in terms of anti-racist praxis. You're still a problem. And in fact, you're my problem. How do we here, within this conference space, experience breakdown? Perhaps in that brief period on the elevator alone with me, she will become unsutured, or perhaps an aspiration to be unsutured, and recognize how we are both part of the same racialized social integument, or skin of America, or of the world. Perhaps she will recognize my being as precarious. I'm using Judith Butler here, but I'm taking Butler in a different direction. Perhaps she will recognize my being as precarious, which denotes dependency, a form of asking, an entreaty, a form of prayer, of supplication. So if what I am ontologically is not a problem, but a site of asking, then what is required is a response. Think here of George Zimmerman, who in 2012 pursued and murdered 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida. Think of the unfolding of the potential of something profoundly beautiful and yet terrifying had George Zimmerman, for an example, become unsutured vis-a-vis Trayvon Martin's body, a body that is an asking. Will you help me? Will you take care of me as I walk in this unfamiliar space? Will you support me as I walk here with effortless grace? Can you see my black body as one that matters? Then again, what happens when the elevator starts up again? The white woman returns to a world in which white skin privilege is systemic, where her white identity continues to be complicit with white norms, where other whites come to live their lives effortlessly when it comes to being white, a world in which they continue to find their way, where they continue to live lives predicated upon lies, and where their racism continues unmarked. So what should this white woman do? What should white people do? What should white culture do? There's a strangeness that shadows addressing this question. I say this because I don't want to be the savior of white people or white culture. And by that I mean I don't want to be the savior of white people and yet be a nigger at the same time. Isn't that too much to ask of me? Nevertheless, I feel trapped. So I say that white culture must be in crisis when it comes to its whiteness. There needs to be a fundamental turning point, a site of uncertainty, off-centeredness, and unsuturing. I desire to see white culture lay down the armory of white privilege and tear apart, be in crisis. Crisis, as I'm using the term, is a species of metanoia, which is a kind of perceptual and psychic breakdown. In the words of James Baldwin, he says that love involves removing the masks that we're afraid we can't live without, but know we can't live with. So I'm asking, is white culture capable of that kind of love? Is white culture capable of the kind of love when Bell Hooks says that it's about telling the truth to yourself and to others? So is white culture prepared to tell the truth to itself? White culture must become a site of double consciousness, both in the way that Linda Alcoff talks about it, but also in the way that I like to talk about it, where white people come to see themselves through our eyes, the eyes of black people and people of color. This will require humility, which etymologically means to be on the ground. Also necessary is a different kind of embodied performance, one that engages a radical relational ontology that speaks to the reality that there are no embodied edges that separate us when it comes to white forms of racialization. This raises the issue of an ethics of no edges. White bodies are always already haptic, that is, a certain kind of touching, vis-a-vis black bodies and bodies of color. Contiguous within a racialized and racist social integument, white modes of cultural being constitute sites of ontological relationality that are indivisible. Hence, whether passive or active with respect to your white racism, you are perpetuating racialized injustice. Whiteness then violates the flesh of living black humanity. In conclusion, then, perhaps there is no place called white cultural innocence. And if this is the case, what do we do? How do we dwell? What is to be expected of us post this conference? And if all that is true, who is prepared to tarry with that? Thank you very much. We're going to sit, right? I think we're going to go up. What happens?
If all the panelists from that session want to join me, and we can. Are you okay to go straight into a conversation, or?
Yeah, I'm good.
Sure. Okay, great.
I think I'm good.
Yeah, of course. Thank you to all three of you. That was incredible, really well put together and interesting for both different and related reasons and ways. Thanks to all of you guys too for sticking with us all day. There'll be a chance for a glass of wine, and of course plenty of opportunity now for questions from you. I thought I'd just ask one really quick question and then pass it straight over, and also if you three have questions for each other, we can develop a conversation that way too. One of the things I've been thinking about in my job, one of my 3 jobs, the one that has a permanent contract at the University of Brighton, I'm labelled an early career academic, and it means I have a little bit of space to manipulate modules and reading lists and try to create more productive relationships with scholarship, to put it generally. I had a conversation with some colleagues who I'll leave nameless about the relationship and the difference between what we might call diversity, which is a kind of or often packaged as a kind of statistical phenomenon in universities and institutions, and then much more radical pushes towards changing pedagogical frameworks. Reading list is one of those things, of course. When I mentioned the word whiteness, there was a stunned look on their face. Firstly, because I am a white middle-class male. Secondly, because it seems strange. And as I mentioned in my introduction, the way that they seem or understand that strangeness is because largely white academics, be them male or female, don't see race as their thing, right? Now, it seems clear to me, in the same way as 10 or 12 years ago when I was an undergraduate student, with respect to patriarchy, gender studies and feminism, it was clear to me that I have to incorporate a rigorous, progressive, can-opening study of these ideas, not as I said in the introduction, tokenistic contributions to a 12-week session on postmodernism where merely one session is on critical approaches to gender studies and feminism, but as an underlying support structure for a pedagogical framework. And this is both speaking to, sorry, I'll wrap up quickly, both speaking to my students that are white and my students that are of colour. And in the various places I've taught, this changes drastically. So just a quick example, one would be at the University of Roehampton in the photography department, the vast majority of my students were black, Christian or Muslim 19, 20-year-olds, 80, 90% of the class, right? That experience is an anomaly compared to the largely white photography courses, indeed the fine art school here, the photography class at the University of Brighton where I teach. So I guess, in a sense, my question is a local one about pedagogy and about education. What do we do to I don't want to use the word emancipate because it seems too grand, but what do we do to struggle against this horrible relationship between, I don't know, what junior academics and young people can do and the sort of stereotypes that are set, as exampled by reading lists, by more senior academics? I wondered whether we could sort of start with that idea perhaps in an education.
So what is the question? Just put it.
Okay, sorry, I realise I rambled. The question is, how can we have critical conversations about whiteness, moving beyond merely anti-racism and beyond a kind of problematic institutional framing of diversity as a statistic?
I have a quick response. Depending on where you are, die in. I mean, in the US, you have the hashtag Black Lives Matter. People die in, right? What I try to do in my classes that are predominantly white, so I've taught at only predominantly white universities. And what I do is I try to create pedagogical spaces that are dangerous. I mean, Zeus, this is not new with me. Who did their talk and had Zeus Leonardo up? But Leonardo's work,
in the introduction, yeah.
We're very familiar. I mean, I know all those folk you mentioned, I know them all, which is so interesting. I really like it. They're my colleagues. But I try to create a dangerous space, which means we have to have white people to rethink the way in which they carry the gravitas. Their whiteness carries an existential gravitas, right? So it's one thing to say that you're white as a student, typically, but it's another to say that there's a way in which my ability to breathe is being asphyxiated by your presence, by your very existence as white. So I'm arguing that to be white, right, one has to really begin not just to thematize the subject, but to think about how one's own embodied existence is implicated in the systemic oppression of bodies of color and black people. So I say if you're going to be serious about this issue, and again, I don't know how serious this space will have generated a certain kind of white anti-racism. Because at the end of the day, for me, the best that white people can be are anti-racist racists. Just as at the end of the day, for me, the best that I can be is an anti-sexist sexist. Right? I can fight the structures, but at the end of the day, I'm still a sexist. At the end of the day, the best of whites will continue to be racist. I have a theory about that, but I don't have time to give that. So I think that if whites are serious, I'd like to see what it's like for white people here in London or wherever to just lie down in the street and die. Now, let me qualify that. I don't mean to physically die. I mean to gesture toward what that looks like and to symbolically do it. I mean, what would it be like at this institution to just say, we refuse to move through the world as white any longer? Because this is what's interesting, that racism is not that which is spectacular. Well, it is that which is spectacular, but the other part is just very mundane. It means you sitting in the audience. That, for me, is what it means to be white and to be racist. It means just to walk across town, as simple as that, right? So it seems to me that we have to get white students to go to bed with a sense of existential unease. I don't know about you all, I don't know about you, but I can tell you about myself. I mean, given all of those comments that impacted my body, it was just incredible. I didn't anticipate how I would feel. But it's amazing what happens to your body when you're called a nigger over 1,000 times, right? So I would have white people go home tonight and get naked by yourselves. Look in the mirror and ask yourself, what's so fucking important about being white? My answer, nothing. What's so important about being black? Well, nothing, from a certain kind of ontology, right? But go home and do that and then see if you can figure out how the norms that are operating here in London or the UK are operating on your skin to make you important, right? And it seems to me when you come to that kind of understanding, undoing whiteness will require a life project. So for me, there is no arrival. I don't argue that there's a place called arrival for white people, just as there's no place called arrival for me as an anti-sexist. So that means that you will constantly in your life undo whiteness every day of your life until the grave. But I'd like to know what that looks like. I haven't seen it in North America, and I can only ask if black people or people of color have seen it here in London or in the UK. My guess is that it has not happened.
Could I just quickly ask, in relation to, let's say, someone like Noel Ignatieff in the States, how you see the political genesis and now framing of that sort of
and the beauty is that he also blurred one of my books. But Ignatieff, he has this funny line, though, right? So they, if you all have read the Alcoff piece, you know that Alcoff critiques what's called the new abolitionist movement. So these are the white folk who believe that we can abolish whiteness, right? And I like that line about whiteness and humanity, the one that you quoted. I like that idea that only because whites have taken themselves to be the very quintessence of the human, which is false. In fact, if white people constitute the human, then we're in serious fucking trouble, right? So here's the question becomes whether whiteness can even be a side of the ethical. Take that question in, drink that one in for a while. But I take it that Ignatieff, I take it that John Warren, David, who's it, David Rodinger, these individuals, or Barbara Applebaum, Judith Butler, I see them as allies. If you look up the etymology of ally, it means to bind to. But here's the problem. Even as we bind together, the system of white supremacy binds them to it. Right? So even as they strive to undo whiteness, right, as my allies, they continue to kill me. That's the way I see it, as a deep, profound, existential, ontological problem. And I don't see any way out of that, by the way. It's not like I have a clear formulaic solution to that. But it seems that if you're going to be my friend, right, and you're going to be white, then if you're going to really have a flourishing, deep, and profound relationship, then you have to understand the way in which you're killing me. Not due to something you've intended, but something that you've inherited structurally and through opacity and through embodiment. But then that means you have to become something else. You have to be more human than you think you are.
Richard, do you want to say something again that speaks to the idea of the white unconscious, which is a way you'd frame this really excellent essay I found of yours, and one of the reasons why I asked you to speak?
If I may, I'll point it at the question of pedagogy,
Sure.
if that's all right.
Yeah.
I don't think we should go into classrooms with the assumption that we know what needs to be taught or what there is to be learned. I don't think that we should go into classrooms with the assumption that we know what's going on in their heads. Now that complicates this whole discussion, but not necessarily in a bad way. I think that one of the things that we do, certainly in the UK university system, and I don't know if that's true in the United States, but I think that we have an education system which is structured around guilt. And I don't mean this sort of, I don't mean this racial guilt, I mean like literally guilt to get you to comply. You're going to get a couple of emails if you haven't been in 2 classes or whatever. There's no sense in which education is structured around what brought you into the classroom in the first place. Why on earth would you be here wasting your time? You know, are you here because you want to please your parents? Are you here because you want to displease them? Are you here because you have some future career in mind? Do you have no idea why you're here? The complete and full body and weight of experience of the students involved, I think, has to be brought into it. But then, of course, that raises an interesting question, is whether that can come out. I mean, anybody who teaches will probably have seen experiences of classrooms with a different racial makeup, where I think if you've got black students, they're more likely to be quiet. Sometimes. I think sometimes they're more likely to feel like they can't participate. Mm-hmm. And you, as a teacher, if you're a white teacher, you have to think about this. Are you engaging the full weight of their experience? Do you know how to do this? And I don't claim to have any straightforward answer to this, but in terms of the arguments about the white unconscious, the accumulated logic of it is more or less exactly what I'm sorry, George Clancy?
Yancy.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
Yancy, sorry.
Clancy's kind of nice, too.
What George Yancy said, which is essentially, I mean, I might not phrase it in exactly this way, but essentially, you know, if you're subjectivated as white, if you're interpreted as white, you're reproducing whiteness, and that means you're reproducing violence, white supremacy, and so on, and that's got to be factored into your approach to the classroom as well. Do I have any answers to that? No. But I think ignorance is not always a bad place to start.
Can I chime in with that? Yeah, so I agree. I would say that what white students have to come to terms with, or what we have to do pedagogically in this space of creating, within the context of the classroom where we create a dangerous space, partly what we're trying to do is get white students, at least in my case, and I think consistent with this idea, is that you don't know the limits of your own racism. That's a heavy thing to, and this is what I guess what I was arguing early in the back, when I spoke out about being more intellectual about the issue, right? My claim is that to be white, you can't know the limits of your own racism. And there's so many wonderful examples of this. Just very quickly, there's a case, you know, Tim Wise, I don't know if you all know his name. He writes about white privilege. He's a white guy. And he was once getting on an airplane, and as he got on, and by the way, he's an anti-racist, right? He writes about white privilege. And when he gets on the airplane, he sees that there are African-American pilots in the cockpit. And then he goes, oh my God, can these guys fly this plane? Right? And he says, no matter what I knew to be true, it didn't help me. No matter what I knew to be true. There are these cases where they hook white people up to MRI machines, and they hook it up to the amygdala, and they show them images of black faces and white faces at a millisecond. So there's no way they can consciously say what they've seen. Turns out when they see images of black faces, the amygdala, there's a lot of activity in the amygdala, which is the flight or fight, right, region. There are cases where they look at neuronal mirroring, where a monkey will look at another monkey, and what happens in the monkey's brain neurologically will reflect that other monkey that's doing that particular activity. Turns out when they hook up white people to these MRIs to register, to measure neuronal imaging, when white people see people of color or black people, the result is as if they're looking at a blank wall. So there's something about the cancellation of the humanity of black people. So what does this mean? It means that white people have to undergo a kind of epistemological humility and come to terms with the fact that they don't understand the limits of their own whiteness, which to me involves the gift. And what is that gift? It's the gift of the black gaze in this case. The gift of the black gaze, to see yourself through our eyes. Right? But that's heavy, right? That's something you have to carry. But then that puts me in that awkward position of being sort of a savior figure and yet being the target of being called a nigger 1,000 times, right? But it seems to me, you know, a Latina philosophy grad student once asked me the question after the publication of Dear White America, why do you continue to talk to white people? It was a good question. Because I was thinking, well, fuck white people, right? Why should I spend my life, which is very short, by the way, and it is very short, because all of us in this room, just wrap your heads around this, in 100 years, none of us will be alive. Sorry about that, but we won't. Rotting corpses, that's what we'll be. So what do we do between the birth and the grave? Right? Becomes a very serious question. And so I said, you know, that's a good question. And I have colleagues who say, take your whatever that intelligence you have and use it toward black folk and folk of color. Why waste your time when white people will never change? I say it's because of the love of my black sons and the love of white children. Maybe there's a chance. So I kind of given up on white adults. Right? And the tricky part is that now that Donald Trump, you guys at least don't have a Trump to deal with. Well, actually you do. Probably. Yeah, you do. Sorry. All right, sorry, you do. All right, you do. But we feel it at a more intimate, intensive level, right? Here's the tricky part. I think that it's now harder for white people to deal with the question of whiteness precisely because now there's a Trump. Because what they'll do so easily is say, you see, that's the guy we don't want to be, right? Or you see what happened in Charlottesville? We're not the neo-Nazis or the skinheads or the Klan. We're not that. But that's the problem. Do you guys know Anderson Cooper? Yeah. CNN? When he is talking, there was a moment where he was talking with like 5 black pundits, and they were all talking about Charlottesville. They could all agree what was going on, what happened at Charlottesville was a problem. But my point was, as I was yelling at the television, I was saying the problem is with Anderson Cooper. It's his whiteness. And he's also gay, right? How would Anderson Cooper, how would his life reflect the life of, what's the other guy's name, the black one, African-American, who's gay? His name's out of my head now. Who? Yeah, Don Lemon, right? Why don't they get together and talk about the ways in which their lives are very different, right? So the problem of whiteness is not in Charlottesville, although that's a problem, but that's the spectacular stuff. We know that. What I'm afraid of is the Anderson Coopers and the white privilege and the way it operates and manifests itself precisely on CNN, right there, right?
Yeah, thanks. I want to go to the question of what counts as knowledge, because I think that also underlay what you're talking about, like curricular changes and also changes you make to the reading list. One of the things that struck me over the years that I've been an academic, which has been like a really very long time in the UK in different universities in the North, is the absolute delegitimization faced by black women academics in the classroom as people who can teach, people who bear knowledge, people who do research, people who write, people who are academics, in short. There's that part. There's also absolute delegitimization of any knowledge that comes from a black person or a person of color still in the UK, including Stuart Hall. You know, people don't, some of my first years didn't even know he was a black man because he had like a white sounding name like me, Shirley. Yeah, I shouldn't even say Shirley anymore. I'm going to change just using my middle name, right? I'll say Shirley Ann, after what I saw this morning. Being Shirley is really hard at the minute. Anyway. Seriously. So, you know, faced with that delegitimization where you have colleagues saying things like, no theory has ever come out of the Caribbean. Critical race theory isn't race theory. Post-colonial theory, what on earth is that? And if you're a black studies scholar who does cultural studies, or you just do shopping and handbags, for example, you see the fight that there still remains in terms of curricular change, right? So it's not only white people who strive to be anti-racist, who would be our anti-racist allies, that have got severe problems with the incredible edifice that is the white academy in this country, right? We also have students who face incredible problems with this lack of awareness of what counts as knowledge to them, like you said, right? We've got black students who are still faced with reading lists, which are just with white people, dead and alive. We have women's and gender studies courses in this country that don't even have one black feminist or feminist of color on the reading list. That's just like standard. And if you see anything kind of different, you have to think, whoa, that is so amazing that they've included Pat Hill Collins on the reading list. You know, that's really progress. This is the 21st century. You know, black people have been contributing to knowledge for many centuries. But it's about this continuation of like white supremacy. What counts as knowledge must be white. The only body that should occupy the academic space must be a white one, be that woman or man, you know. The only person that can do critical theory must be a white person. Because after all, you know, black people don't have a critical thought in their head. All they know about is rap, hip hop, and reggaeton. So, and what does that count for anyway?
George, it reminds me of something you said in a previous lecture. I've watched all of them on YouTube. They're fantastic. About, I think it might have been Kant. It was someone from the canon. Yeah, sure. And this idea of parroting and the black philosophical body. Yeah,
so I mean, by the way, this happens in the U.S. too. I mean, I've been told by, in On Race, I interviewed Paul Gilroy, and so he talks about the sheer paucity of black professors here. But the same thing happens in the U.S., by the way. We occupy positions of, so to do African-American philosophy, for an example, is to do something quite exotic, right? To teach African-American literature, that's exotic. It's different from literature. right? Or philosophy is different, African American philosophy is different from philosophy. That's the real stuff, right? Of course, that's a problem. I mean, Anita Allen, who now teaches at University of Pennsylvania and is a law professor as well, she said that a white professor once, while she was in her office, while she was in his office, and by the way, she was going for a PhD, he grabbed her face, he gently grabbed her face and pulled her face toward him and said, "You know, Anita, you remind me of a maid we used to have," right? So, that's the kind of deep contradiction that black women in the United States have to experience, right? And so this idea of going into the classroom and being denuded of your knowledge, right? That you don't really know. You can't possibly be prepared to teach philosophy. And in my case, the canon itself speaks against me. I mean, philosophy is predominant. African Americans make up 1.1% of the profession of philosophers in the United States, right? And not only are the spaces that we inhabit at APA conferences, for an example, monochromatically white, where I'm often saying to myself, I don't feel comfortable here, I feel alienated, and my white grad students say, why? Well, because there are no people of color in this space, right? For me, it's a corrupt space. It's a space of white men jerking off, and some white women. So if you can just try to imagine that for a moment. It's a site of debauchery, right? Of white men and white women just jerking off, talking to themselves. But in reference to Kant, I mean, everybody knows Immanuel Kant, right? Yep. Immanuel Kant held that to be black from head to toe is clear proof that what I say is stupid. So and this is the Kant of the three critiques, right? So if you held a curtain over me and had me say something interesting, like, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all of our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And Kant was on the other side, he'd say, my God, let me see who that guy is. Raise the curtain, he would say, oh shit, he's black from head to toe. Clearly what he said is stupid. And David Hume, you guys know David Hume? I love David Hume. I had pictures of David Hume when I was like 17 years old on my wall. David Hume said that all that I can be is a parrot. So black people can parrot stuff, but we can memorize stuff, but we don't know what it is that we're saying. And Hegel, everybody knows Hegel. Hegel said there was no Geist in sub-Saharan Africa, meaning there was no spirit. Thomas Jefferson, he says that in his notes on Virginia, says that that the orangutan, the male orangutan, prefers to fuck a black woman over the female of its own species. How did he get to know that?
And there was
God forbid.
There was some Hemings.
But what I'm suggesting is that, look, when we're facing texts, I mean, Immanuel Kant's text, when I pick it up, the Critique of Pure Reason, and I've read it, it's saying to me, you can't read me. Yeah. So there's a way in which the canon itself is an act of violence against my very being. It says I'm not an epistemic subject. I undergo a process of epistemic injustice, precisely through the curriculum itself, which is another performance of whiteness. Yeah, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I was just saying about Jefferson and his black lover.
Yeah, Sally Heming.
Sally Heming.
Yeah, so that's Jefferson, who thinks that black people can't imagine. But apparently the black women are good for something.
Okay.
Do you have any questions for each other or comments? Otherwise, I'll open it up to the floor. I'm sure we have a lot.
I enjoyed everything that I've heard from you, and I'm so glad to meet you all, so to share our work together.
Okay.
I'm just glad to be in London. I got to eat with a lot of white people the other day. It was so formal. Go ahead. Anyway.
Hello. I wanted to ask you, the panel, how is it possible to have a learning institution where the only people of colour, or the majority of people of colour working there, are in security or cleaners. How is that possible in the UK?
Oh, I can't answer for the UK, sorry.
No.
Well, maybe Shirley can.
That's a really good question. I mean, you highlight the level of the racial injustice in this country, right? Where still the place that black bodies should occupy is security, cleaning, and cooking, basically, you know, within institutions. If you look at institutions in general, you know, we all know the dismal, really dismal numbers of black professors there are in this country who are women of African descent. I was only the 25th one out of I don't know how many thousands, and that was in April this year that I became the 25th one. There might be a few more now of African descent, but that's dismal when you think about it. You go and you look at any university in this country, just go do it tomorrow in the one you're in, do it here if you're from here. Just see how many black women, women of color, people of color that teach you. Somebody just said none? Where did I? None. None. None.
And now, therein lies the problem.
Yeah, and therein lies the problem, because if you think about the student population, there are many people of color in the student population. If you think about the population of London in general, you see what I'm saying. So you have to wonder to yourself, as I wondered when I came from Jamaica as a migrant in 1975, where are the black people here? What happened?
I'm an academic, and 9 years ago I worked into, I won't say the university I work at, but I walked in there and I just felt completely disheartened because that was the scene that greeted me. Yeah. And I thought, what does this say about education in the UK? Yeah. And I'm in London.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Yeah.
Well, it partly, I think, belies, I mean, I love etymology, so partly belies the very notion of education coming from educare, which means to lead out, right? If you think about the term Bildung, the German, a kind of cultivation, or paideia, right? All of these terms, they mean something more radical than what we have, right? And if we apply it to whiteness, then it's clear that whiteness is to lead out, be led out, right? Take that figuratively, right? In some way. Because otherwise, I mean, if we really believe in sort of epistemic diversity, and for me, diversity has to involve moving the center of whiteness, because as long as whiteness remains the center, diversity is just a farce, right? So we have to undo whiteness as a structure. So that's what you got, right? But I think you're right. You can't have genuine education, which is a site of danger, and for it to be monochromatically white, given all of the problems of epistemology of ignorance and bad faith, et cetera, et cetera. What you're going to do is get a white constructed world, one that's predicated on white metaphysics, white epistemology, white ontology, white aesthetics, white axiology, white politics, you name it. So I guess the question might be is, since this is the question, what should white culture do, is maybe we have to throw it back at white people in this context. What is it that you're supposed to do? I mean, I'm asking that question of white people here, present. What are you going to do? I get to fly out, by the way. I don't like flying, so I'm going to take my medicine. But I get to fly out Monday. But I leave London and go back to the belly of the beast. But what are you all going to do, right, in London or in the UK, such that these questions aren't posed? Well, I guess they will always be posed, but I guess I'm saying, what has this conference accomplished? It certainly is not designed to make white people feel good. That can't be what it is. I mean, because there are examples of white people in the United States who like to fantasize about being beaten by black people. You guys don't want that. I mean, that's perverse, right? So what do you expect to happen after this conference? My suspicion is that there will be another conference, and then another conference, and then another conference, ad nauseum, and we'll all be dead, as I said, in 100 years. So is this the peak of it? Is this the peak of enlightenment right now, at this moment, for white folk? If it is, then, well, damn. Well, sorry. I guess I'm dead. And that might sound like a joke, but I'm quite serious.
Sorry, I'm talking a bit too much, I know. But
Am I talking too much?
No, I am.
Oh, you are.
I'm not picking up.
No, you're not.
I was going to say, I've got to hand it to you, Dr. Yancy, because my own experience working in education is there is a lot of skirting about avoiding the elephant in the room, and I think what you do really well is to call things out, and that's hugely important. Otherwise, you do just talk and talk. The amount of meetings I've gone to where I just think, what did we actually achieve? And we were there to talk about race. We were there to talk about making changes for the students. And it's like, okay, somebody has to, talk about this elephant in the room. Absolutely. And I just wanted to say one last thing, sorry, hijacking this, that I do workshops with tutors around social justice in education. And one of the tutors that I was working with, who was a white guy, he said, well, what do you want me to do, Melody? Do you want me to change my colour? I can't become a black man. And, I thought, I teach white students, and I've honed up on loads of things that I think white students would be interested in. So why can't you, additionally, add to your curriculum those things that students of colour will be interested in? It's not rocket science.
No. Yeah.
Just really briefly, it also reveals a particular kind of ignorance I've had with other white academic men, where they still attribute their whiteness to their skin. And it's this and I say, whiteness is a social construct, and they're like, and it's like, the way that in the other courses you teach, we speak about gender and sex being a social construct. Think just a little bit closely, not that it's the same framework or you can draw an even parallel, but begin to think about, not this. I'm reminded of what you said, George, about Cornel West in that, I think it's a collection of interviews, You're a Fae, I'm a Fae, when he says, it makes that recommendation to white people to look deep in the mirror for the soul, not for the skin. Yeah, absolutely, and I'll keep it like that, but your point reminds me of the conversations I've had with, it's always more senior colleagues because of my age.
And quite frankly, I don't want white people to change their skin. I want to know exactly who they are. Do you know what I mean? I want them to confront their own whiteness. That's what I want. That's the kind of honesty I'm looking at, the kind of humility that I'm looking at, that fearlessness to be torn apart, and to dwell in that space of suffering. Because we get to suffer all the time, right? We suffer. So what does it mean to grieve over the loss of that thing that you, quite frankly, shouldn't have anyway? Which is a humanity as humanity. You shouldn't have that. When that humanity is defined over and against those who are deemed infrahuman or subhuman, right?
I think one of the great blocking strategies, I was talking to you about that this morning earlier because of what happened at a panel I was on Tuesday in a university to remain nameless. One of the great blocking strategies of whiteness in this country, increasingly I've noticed, is to say, why do you deal with black and white all the time? After all, we're all human. Of course, forgetting that the category human is itself white, if you think about it really historically. And as Sylvia Wynter has so rightly told us, right? We're all human. Some of us are more human than others.
Richard, I think you wanted to...
I do. I want to say something about the question of what we're supposed to achieve with this conference. Absolutely nothing. Or rather, I'll probably put it another way. I don't think that you disperse unconscious investments by having a chat or by working things out. I think the unconscious is an intrinsically conservative force and that it changes through action. I mean, talking is part of it. I mean, I believe in the talking cure, as it were. And there is, to some extent, a space where, or it would be beneficial if there were spaces where people could talk through their whiteness and so on. But I don't think that's enough. I think you have to be engaged in something else. And what is that something else? Well, obviously I have an agenda. I think you have to be engaged in a social struggle to change the society from top to bottom. And I don't think it's sufficient to attack it on one axis, because, I mean, you know, the cliches we have to talk about intersectionality. I don't particularly like that metaphor, but it'll do just fine. It's better than many of the others out there. And the point is that there are different forms of power that have a shared and overlapping kind of logic, and that if we want to do something about that, then we have to get organized, we have to be politically constituted, and we have to work out some shared goals and agendas. And in that context, then you'll begin to see people changing their subjectivities, questioning things. That is just one of the most common things about politicization and radicalization in history. And I'm not saying that that will solve all our problems, far from it. I'm just saying that that's where I would begin, not in a conference. And just finally, sorry, just on this, there is a room, I think, and there has to be room in political organizing as well as in education for that which is useless. In other words, for having a conversation, for working things out that doesn't have a practical application in the real world. You know, when you would ask your teacher, yeah, but teacher, when are we going to use this in the real world? You're not. That's why you're learning it. It's fun and it's good for you. And that's, you know, there should be a space where we can thrash stuff out which doesn't have to have an immediate real world application.
Except if you're thinking about those kinds of issues, you are, you know, I mean, if you're engaging with it, then it starts from, then it starts from the minute you take your first breath in, following that conversation. And I think, you know, I think that has to be measured, actually. And I'm going to give another example. You know, I had a conversation once with Stuart Hall, the Stuart Hall, you know, and said to him, in the context of academia, how do you cope, Stuart? How have you survived all of these decades? And his response was, you have to scream really loudly. And you have to keep screaming. Now, for those of us who are going to lie down, you know, and protest, and I think it's necessary, I do, you know, the system is highly complex. It has tentacles that are far-reaching, and the impact of that has real-life consequences on our entire being, you know, psychically, physically, emotionally, in all kinds of ways. And it's a heck of a journey to kind of get through that. But I think, nevertheless, that, you know, placing ethics somehow at the base of that is really key. In the context of this institution, where I was a student, it was very interesting. I don't know if you'll ever invite me back, but I don't really care, frankly. I was interviewed for a job here, and my interview went swimmingly, it went very well. I was told that I was incredibly qualified for the position that I'd applied for, but I didn't get the job. Interestingly, I ran into one of the women who had been on my interview panel, who is an academic staff member here, several months later, and she looked at me quizzically, and I said, yes, we know each other because you were on my interview panel when I didn't get the job. And her response to me was, which was, I mean, it made me, I had to laugh actually privately. Her response was, oh yes, you were incredibly qualified, you had amazing qualification. I said, yeah, but somehow I didn't get that job. And she said, no, in the end we appointed somebody else who was already a visiting tutor, and we just felt that she had already contributed to the course so much. Now this woman is a white woman, the one she's talking about. So even, and I don't want to get personal, I don't give a shit about it actually, I'm quite glad I didn't, but because I think there are some real issues with this particular institution. That's a whole other thing. But what was so fascinating is that I actually thought, you need to really unpick the information that you've given me, because
the person you've appointed is not your niece or your sister or your mother or your aunt or your lover, but she is somebody, thank you, who is someone within your own particular social network and circle. So there's a kind of strange sense of nepotism that's going on there. And in that sense, you know, how we begin to think about, you know, pedagogy and changing those kinds of platforms, those kinds of spaces, and also, you know, making sure that so in other words, my reading of that was that even if you're highly qualified, which I am, and I was for that particular position, it didn't mean a shit, actually.
Absolutely not.
And I think that, as I say, I don't actually give a damn, you know, and I don't really care if you're listening and blah blah blah, quite frankly. But these things need to be identified, and I think that what might be interesting is the point at which, and I know that this case of Weinstein has liberated something, there's a lot of conflicting views about this, but I think there is something really interesting and important about the naming, actually. And I think that, I'm not trying to make an exact parallel, but I think that there is a place at which the context of this endless cycle of racism that exists and this kind of system that's emulated and perpetuated endlessly, you know, you have to begin to think, well, there needs to be a point at which some things need to be named. And that becomes a very complicated concern, because then you're entering into legal territory, right? But nevertheless, I think that the question of justice and ethics, which has been raised several times, I know, Anthony, you raised it earlier on, it is something that we need to embrace, you know. And I don't think that somebody was talking about complaining as well. Was that you? No. Okay. I don't know. Maybe I've read another article and I'm bringing the two things.
It was me.
But the whole. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So that whole context of what it means to engage and to confront, and then, you know, to be undermined by somebody who is really struggling to come to terms with what I pose, or what a woman or a man who of color, a black man, a black woman, poses as a threat to that individual's, that white individual's psyche. It is quite extraordinary. I've experienced exactly what you described in the lift in my institution, where somebody I work with has come in to see, you know, just happened to be there as I'm about to start my tutorials or my class of teaching. And what I tend to do is say, oh, come and join us, you know, how fabulous you're here, come and join us. But it is this sense of, there are all kinds of extraordinary, you know, micro levels of aggression, actually, that happen in the day-to-day existence of both students of color and academics of color. And I think that these are some of the things that actually need to be confronted and dealt with. As I say, I've almost gotten beyond, you know, caring about those things, because I just think, I also believe that I think that there's a great deal of sexism and misogyny that comes into play within that context. So sometimes I have to also ask myself, I wonder if I had been a black man, you know, a man of color, whether you would be treating me like this. And I think that in that sense, there is a kind of other level of play within that. I can't be, you know, I can only describe my experience in those kinds of situations. But nevertheless, I think that they are things that need to be identified. And in order for institutions like this, or perhaps the work you work in. I think they need to be confronted. I think those people who are doing those things at some point need to be named. I really do. Thank you.
I've been asked to wrap it up, but can we continue? Do you think we can take another question? What exactly is the time?
Or maybe several questions, and then in one, like, we'll answer them in one?
Mm-hmm.
Let several people speak, and then we can answer them in one little...
There's one of the current students here that, right in the middle, yeah, with your hand up there.
Have all three asked, and we'll...
Yeah, sure,
Yeah.
let's do them all and then you guys...
Hi, I'm a current student here at the RCA. Bad at public speaking. My background is in sociology. I studied at Tufts University in the States. So my question for the panel, which I'll give context to, is what advice do you have for students who are trying to call out these issues at institutions who are being constantly silenced? And what advice do you have for these students as they continually experience colonial violence and racial violence on a daily basis at the hands of their tutors and peers? And I mean, it's clear to me that the RCA is a place that's really afraid to talk about race. I've never seen the work of William J. Pope be presented without the words black or race being said in presenting his work. And like, I've never been in a place where one of my students and my fellow students and peers can like make images of black women dying and that be like dismissed as minor sexism, which is happening right now in the print department. And yeah, also presenting staff with not even saying things to them, just presenting them with statistics and figures on their reading lists, which they tell you are not real reading lists because they're not compulsory, where every single person who is a theorist that they're asking us to read is white. So yeah, what advice do you give us in surviving?
Was there just one?
Are the questions related? That's a really good question.
Yeah. I think definitely very related,
great.
and maybe I'm repeating what have been said, but I think there was the danger, we stressed on the danger of the absence of the counter narrative, but there's also this power dynamic within this institution of the tutor, where people of other race like me are meant to somehow present or portray an image they already have of an Arab, or especially within the contemporary art scenario, which is definitely a Western exported kind of concept and somehow still function a very Western dialogue. Our work has been constantly either fetishized as being Arab. We've been asked questions about how political our work is, on basis that's completely out of the context that we're coming from. So I think that power that a lot of, I even question the consciousness of Arab artists after they leave, it's more problematic because of the kind of things that rubbed on us, believing that this is the emancipated artist that came from the East or the Arab world, that, I suddenly now talk as though I am a white person or more intellectual person. So, yeah.
Okay, let's take the third question and then we'll go back to the first so you can remind us what it was.
Hi, so my question is, there's a problem in India right now where there are Nigerian students being attacked regularly in the past couple of years. So my question is basically, do you have any idea of where that racism comes from? A racism from brown to black or black to black, or kind of eliminating the whiteness of it. So,
yeah. The first question, I mean, I'm sorry I can't give you anything more elaborate than this. The first thing that came to mind is, if I were here, I'd fight on your behalf. I'm not here, right? So you're in a peculiar situation in as much as you have an absence of black bodies and bodies of color here in positions of power, right? And just as a qualifier, because I heard this reference earlier, every black body and brown body is not a liberated body. By the way, just throw that out there. Right? So what do I do? What do I say to you? I say that like-minded people like you need to create safe spaces where you get to talk, where you get to unload, right? Like I get to unload all this shit, right? In nigger. You need to create. Are you a student here? Yeah. Then you need to create a space here of like-minded students. Students, are you a woman of color? A woman of color. I mean, for me, I wouldn't immediately invite white people into that space. That's just my position. They'll call it discrimination. I call it self-empowerment, right? Until they're ready, whatever that looks like. Because when I leave, I mean, you're going to remain, and you have to do something with that. So what do I suggest? Although it sounds counterintuitive, I think you have to rely on those white professors who have some power, who are prepared to give up that power to stand up for you, right? Now, I don't know who those white professors are, but they need to be beholden to what you need. I mean, so if there are any professors here in this space, I think that we have a woman of color who is pleading and who is asking for help. And if you're here, damn it, then you need to help her. What more is there to say, right? White folk need to help you. Those white folk who are enlightened enough, right? Although they're going to fuck up things still. But that's all right, right? I'd rather have a white person who fucks up things than a white person who doesn't give a damn, in that sense, you know what I mean? So again, if I were here, I would be with you as an ally. I'm sorry that I'm not. And I'd put that in the laps of those professors who are here to listen to her voice and to hear her pain and suffering.
While George has been talking, I've been thinking about what I could say in terms of the three questions. And to be brief, because like it's 8 o'clock, I'm kind of old, I should be in bed already. I've got a long journey ahead of me to get back to, okay, so I don't want to take too long. We need coalitions. We need coalitions. For example, you know, there's the Wise My Curriculum Wide campaign, which has been going on in this country for a long time. There's Fallism in South Africa. There is hashtag Black Lives Matter in the United States, which is also here. We need anti-racist societies in the Students' Union, like they've got at Warwick, for example. They've got that, and the Student Union funds it. We need to encourage more people of color to be actively involved in the Students' Union as officers in the Student Union as well, right? We need to think about whether or not we can't have a woman of color feminist reading group, for example. All these are easy things you can do, but it's about working together rather than thinking that you can do it as an individual. Because trust me, you'll end up totally burned out by it all, unable to function. Anti-African descent racism is global, so that is where you're going to be getting your Indian example from. And to your question as well, we have to really struggle against becoming epistemologically white or whitened. And we have to always go back, I think, to what Bell Hooks tells us. She says we must remain on the margin as a site of radical possibilities in order that black anti-racist politics can continue. Black feminist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist politics can continue. So, you know, whiteness is something we have to struggle with on every level, including that of epistemology.
Go, you go.
Oh,
you go. Sorry.
I'll try and be brief then. I can't be very useful in terms of telling you how to call out these issues because I think it's been dealt with. I just wanted to comment, actually. The idea that what you've been given is not a real reading list because it's not compulsory. It's absolute bullshit. How the hell are you supposed to do the course if you don't read the reading list? And they know this. That's absolutely insulting. And I'm sorry that you're getting that. You know, I mean, I have to say that, you know, there's a background which is not, I mean, you know, it's not innocent of race, nothing is, but it's partly about the neoliberal restructuring of universities here and the fact that staff are increasingly terrified and managerially controlled. There's a traditional kind of model of teaching where you have this autonomy in the classroom, and that's very white in its own way, and not just white and male and bourgeois and various other things too, there's no question about that, but it's being replaced with something else, which is a very managed and proletarianized sort of situation wherein the teacher is expected to be an automaton, you know, subjecting you to these testable slabs of knowledge. And that the only question is how technically proficient the teacher is in guilting you into internalizing all this. And I think that's a model of education we have to break with and we have to resist and fight. Okay, briefly, I did want to comment on brown to black racism. I didn't feel it's exactly my place on this, but there is one thing that occurred to me I think might be useful just to think about. Isn't it interesting that in Britain, in the last 15, 20 years or so, quite a lot of anti-immigrant racism came from black Britons. Yeah, that's a fact. And if you were campaigning, on the doorstep, you would find that. And I don't think that that's, that somehow means, oh well, you know, it's not whiteness anymore. It actually is implicated in whiteness. But the interesting thing is, I think it's tangled up with the idea that, you know, essentially Conservative and Labour governments made Black Britain a political offer. Your Britishness is accepted on subordinate terms, right? Just don't rock the boat too much. Yeah. And that, you know, that some people bought that identification and said, okay, well, as long as these other people don't come here and then start making our situation more precarious. So there's always ways in which this, I mean, it's an intrinsically volatile, dangerous and violent system. Sorry, just one last comment, and I wanted to address it to you and what you said, if that's all right. You talked about naming. I in the strongest and most passionate way possible, I want to suggest be very, very careful about that. I did a lot of work on child abuse and child sexual abuse, and I watched the inquiries unfolding and all the scandals and so on. This is the predecessor to the Me Too thing and the Harvey Weinstein effect. Before Harvey Weinstein, there was Jimmy Savile. And what happened was that something that was very genuinely a systemic, structural problem, very widespread, became filtered through the psychic and libidinal economies of the mass media and social media. And what did you end up with? Most of the inquiries fell apart because this wasn't structured around meeting the needs of people who suffered from abuse. It was structured around a media spectacle. And I fear that's what's to some extent happening here. Not completely.
I need to just respond to that.
Okay.
When I'm talking about naming, I'd actually like to see it not through a social media campaign. Yeah. Actually, I'm talking about a judicial approach, yeah. Because I think that needs to happen. Of course, the problem will inevitably be that, you know, the lawyers of most institutions such as this will end up backing those who are racist, potentially, or sexist, and that is an endless conundrum. So, but I hear what you're saying entirely about that, and it's a very complicated thing, and, you know, part of a longer conversation, because I do also hear the context. I mean, it's a very complex kind of set of politics. So, but my belief is that that there needs to be judicial support. I'm not sure that we'll ever achieve it in this country because the system's fucked, basically, right? It's already set up to fail those kinds of inquiries, actually. But I do believe that there is something in it. But meanwhile, I think that the advice that, Shirley, that you've given about trying to, and indeed George, about trying to appeal to the conscience, in your case, of white professors, tutors who are hopefully going to listen. They may fuck up, but hopefully they'll listen. And also in terms of trying to establish those kinds of reading groups, those kind of support structures that would assist students. What I think might be interesting, and we all already know from various cases that are kind of ongoing with institutions in this country, that that the whole procedure of going through judicial inquiries and trials and blah blah blah, that too is a prison sentence, and but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not necessary. I do believe that a judicial inquiry it has to at some point come into force or place.
Can I just say one thing, and that's it? So one last thing I wanted to say, that I don't want to be a moment of vulnerability for me, so you don't think that I think I've got all this figured out, because I don't. I'm a sexist, right? I have not resolved that problem. I'm an anti-sexist sexist. I work on that, will probably work on that for the rest of my life. But I think that what we have to be careful of is accommodation to whiteness. So what I like to see, because it's easy for us to accommodate, meaning we might think, all of us who've presented today might think that our ideas are radical and brilliant, and they challenge the system. But what's interesting is that we've been given space to precisely do what we're doing. Isn't that peculiar? Yeah. Right? So there's a way in which even that's been consumed. Right? So as radical as I think I am, guess what? I still get paid at Emory.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be careful. What we want whiteness to do is to choke, not to consume. So I'm going to leave you with that metaphor.
I think there's still time for a quick drink. Do you know what time we have to be out of the building? Let's have a drink and see how it goes.
8:20.
No, indeed.
Just organised another seminar about object-oriented.
That would have been interesting. Oh, shoot, I forgot about that. Okay, how long? Okay, cool. Yeah.
I can, if you've got a provide, I can. Sorry, I literally, it's so hot up there that I need to empty my pockets. JANIS, Dark Relations, network. I'll go ask you. Yeah, yeah, if you get a bounce back, Johnny Gold. Yeah, someone like that. That emotion.
So much there.
I know it's always one of the great benefits. It's about our me like to work here well. Yeah. It's always stuff that Thank you so much. Great, great, great.
All these things, and then I was like, should we see if we can get a glass of wine? Fuck yes. I don't know whether it's my jacket. We've got to be out of but there's also no, I agree with you. I don't know what and you know, I'm thinking about everything to say about if I come to my goodness. Yeah, I know.